Tonight, we journey into the twilight of empires, where the dying light of Rome meets the rising storm from the east. In the mists of the 5th century, when civilization balanced on a knife's edge, there emerged a figure whose very name became synonymous with divine wrath and earthly conquest. Attila the Hun, scourge of God, destroyer of worlds, yet also a man of flesh and blood, dreams and ambitions. As you settle into rest, let us explore not just the external conquests of this legendary conqueror, but the deeper currents of history, identity, and the eternal human struggle between order and chaos that his story represents. The world that would witness Attila's rise was already trembling on the edge of transformation. By the 4th century after Christ, the Roman Empire that had once seemed as eternal as the stars themselves was showing unmistakable signs of mortality. The great machine of conquest and administration that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries was grinding slower, its gears worn by the friction of time and the weight of its own ambitions. Picture, if you will, the vast expanse of the Roman world in this twilight hour, from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria, from the Rhine's cold waters to the cataracts of the Nile. An empire stretched that had once moved with the precision of a well-ordered legion, but now, like an aging giant, it struggled to maintain its grip on territories that had grown too vast for any single authority to govern effectively. The crisis had begun in the previous century, that dark period historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. For 50 years, from 235 to 284, the empire had convulsed in what seemed like its death throes. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, some ruling for mere months before meeting violent ends. The great cities that had been the pride of Roman civilization found themselves repeatedly sacked by barbarian raids. Trade routes that had carried the wealth of the world became highways for invading armies. The economy, once the marvel of the ancient world, had collapsed into chaos. The silver denarius, backbone of Roman commerce, had been debased so thoroughly that it contained barely 5% of its original precious metal content. Inflation ravaged the provinces as emperors printed money to pay armies that were increasingly composed of foreign mercenaries rather than Roman citizens. The great public works projects that had been the hallmark of Roman engineering came to a halt, their half-finished remains standing as monuments to abandoned dreams. Yet the empire had not died. Like a phoenix rising from its own ashes, it had been reborn under the iron will of Diocletian and Constantine. These emperors had recognized that the old ways could not continue unchanged. The empire was simply too large, too complex, too diverse to be ruled as it had been in the days of Augustus. So they had divided it, creating the revolutionary concept of multiple emperors ruling simultaneously over different regions. The Tetrarchy, as this system came to be known, represented both salvation and fracture. 4 rulers now shared the purple, each responsible for defending and administering a portion of the whole. It brought stability, yes, but at the cost of unity. The empire began to develop distinct Eastern and Western identities, each with its own capital, its own armies, its own concerns and priorities. Constantine had taken this division even further by founding a new capital in the east. Constantinople, built on the ancient site of Troy's rival Byzantium, was designed to be a new Rome, a Christian Rome that would embody the empire's spiritual transformation. The city rose from the waters of the Bosphorus like a vision of heavenly Jerusalem, its golden domes and marble palaces reflecting the empire's new faith. But this geographic and spiritual division created its own problems. The Western Empire, with Rome as its increasingly irrelevant ceremonial capital, found itself bearing the brunt of barbarian pressure while possessing fewer resources to resist it. The wealthy provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor now belonged to the Eastern Empire, leaving the West to subsist on the taxes of Gaul, Spain, and an Italy that had long since ceased to be the economic heart of the Mediterranean world. The barbarian pressure that would ultimately reshape the face of Europe had been building for generations. Beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic peoples had been slowly organizing themselves into larger and more formidable confederations. The Alemanni, the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals. These were no longer the scattered tribes that Caesar had encountered in the forests of Germania centuries before. They had learned from their contacts with Rome, adopting Roman military techniques while retaining their own fierce warrior culture. These Germanic peoples were themselves being pressured by movements further east. The Great Eurasian Steppe, that vast grassland that stretched from the Hungarian plain to the borders of China, had always been a source of nomadic peoples who periodically burst forth to terrorize the settled civilizations on its edges. The Huns were merely the latest in a long series of such eruptions, but they would prove to be among the most consequential. The domino effect of their westward movement had already begun by the time Roman historians first took notice of them. In 376, as the shadows lengthened across the 4th century, a people called the Huns appeared north of the Black Sea and shattered the Gothic kingdom that had dominated that region for generations. The Goths, proud and warlike, had thought themselves masters of the Pontic Steppe. They had grown wealthy from trade with the Roman Empire, their leaders adorning themselves with Roman gold and their warriors learning Roman tactics. But the Huns swept away this Gothic prosperity like a summer storm destroys a field of grain. The Gothic king Ermanaric, faced with this unprecedented threat, chose death over dishonor, falling upon his own sword rather than submit to barbarian overlords. His death marked the end of an era, the collapse of a Germanic kingdom that had stood for nearly 2 centuries as a buffer between Rome and the wilder peoples of the East. The Gothic survivors faced an impossible choice. They could remain and submit to Hunnic rule, accepting the status of vassals to these mysterious newcomers from the steppes, or they could abandon their ancestral lands and seek refuge within the Roman Empire, hoping that their old enemies might prove more merciful masters than these new conquerors. Thousands chose the latter course, streaming westward toward the Danube frontier in one of the great migrations of the ancient world. Men, women, and children, warriors and farmers, nobles and slaves, all united in their desperate flight from Hunnic domination. They brought with them their weapons and their livestock, their traditions and their fears, but most importantly, they brought their stories of the terror that pursued them from the east. The Romans, faced with this unprecedented humanitarian crisis, found themselves in an impossible position. Their frontiers were already strained by the pressure of defending an overextended empire. Their armies were undermanned and increasingly dependent on barbarian foederati, allied troops drawn from the very peoples they were supposed to keep out. Yet here were tens of thousands of refugees, many of them skilled warriors seeking admission to Roman territory. The decision to admit the Goths would prove to be one of the most momentous in Roman history. Initially, it seemed like a reasonable solution. The refugees could be settled in depopulated areas, providing both farmers to till abandoned fields and soldiers to defend the frontiers. In exchange for land and protection, they would serve Rome faithfully, their warrior culture channeled into the empire's defense. But the reality proved far more complex than the theory. The Gothic refugees, traumatized by their flight and suspicious of Roman intentions, proved difficult to integrate. Roman officials, corrupt and short-sighted, saw the refugees as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than imperial strengthening. They demanded bribes for basic necessities, sold diseased meat at inflated prices, and even kidnapped Gothic children to sell as slaves. The inevitable explosion came at Adrianople in 378. What had begun as a refugee crisis became a military catastrophe as the Gothic settlers rose in rebellion against their Roman hosts. The Emperor Valens, determined to crush this uprising personally, marched north with the flower of the Eastern Army. On a hot August day outside the city of Adrianople, in what is now European Turkey, two civilizations met in battle. The result was one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. The Gothic cavalry, now reinforced by Hun and Alan allies, shattered the Roman infantry in a single devastating charge. Valens himself perished in the fighting. His body never recovered from the field of slaughter. 2/3 of the Eastern Army died with him, including many of the empire's most experienced officers and administrators. Adrianople sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Not since Cannae, 6 centuries before, had a Roman army suffered such a complete defeat. The news of the disaster reached Constantinople and Rome, like the tolling of a funeral bell, announcing not just the death of an emperor and his army, but the end of Roman military invincibility. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the military losses. For generations, Romans had believed that their superior discipline and tactics made them invincible against barbarian hordes. Individual battles might be lost, but the empire always emerged victorious in the end. Adrianople shattered this confidence, revealing that the empire was no longer the master of its own destiny. In the aftermath of Adrianople, the Romans were forced to confront a new reality. The barbarians were no longer content to remain beyond the frontiers, occasionally raiding for plunder before retreating to their forests and steppes. They wanted land, permanent settlement, a share in the prosperity that Roman civilization had created, and they had the military strength to take it. The Gothic problem was eventually resolved through negotiation rather than conquest. Theodosius, the new Eastern emperor, recognized that the empire lacked the strength to expel the Goths by force. Instead, he granted them federate status, allowing them to settle permanently within Roman territory in exchange for military service. It was a pragmatic solution, but it established a dangerous precedent. The empire was no longer expanding. It was contracting, trading territory for temporary peace. As the 4th century drew to a close, the Roman world was a very different place from what it had been at its beginning. The old certainties were gone, replaced by improvisation and adaptation. The legions that had once conquered the known world were now largely composed of the descendants of their former enemies. The cities that had been the glory of Roman civilization were shrinking, their populations fleeing to the countryside or to the new Christian monasteries that dotted the landscape. Yet life continued, as it always does. In the markets of Constantinople, merchants from India and China still traded their exotic wares. In the schools of Athens and Alexandria, philosophers still debated the great questions of existence. In the monasteries of Egypt and Syria, monks still copied the manuscripts that would preserve classical learning through the dark centuries to come. The empire's transformation was perhaps most visible in its spiritual life. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had become the official religion of the state. Magnificent churches rose in every major city, their soaring domes and glittering mosaics proclaiming the triumph of the new faith. The old gods were not yet entirely forgotten, but they had retreated to the shadows, their temples abandoned or converted to Christian use. This Christianization brought its own challenges. The empire now had to balance temporal and spiritual authority, worldly and otherworldly concerns. Bishops wielded influence that sometimes rivaled that of governors, and theological disputes could generate as much passion as political ones. The unity of faith that Constantine had hoped Christianity would bring proved as elusive as the political unity the empire sought to maintain. Into this world of transformation and uncertainty, the Huns remained a distant but growing threat. After their initial conquests north of the Black Sea, they seemed to pause, consolidating their gains and organizing their new subjects. For 20 years, from 376 to 395, they remained largely quiet, their activities hidden behind the frontier of the Danube. But this quiet was deceptive. Like a storm gathering strength over the ocean, the Hunnic Confederation was growing in power and ambition. They were learning from their new subjects, Goths and Alans, Sarmatians, and other steppe peoples, absorbing their knowledge of Roman military techniques and political organization. They were also growing in numbers, as success attracted new followers from the vast reaches of the Eurasian steppe. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reshape the ancient world. In the east, the Hunnic Confederation was coalescing around leaders of unprecedented ambition and ability. In the west, the Roman Empire was struggling to adapt to challenges that its founders could never have imagined. Between them lay the peoples who would bear the brunt of the coming storm: Goths and Gepids, Vandals and Burgundians, all caught between the anvil of Roman resistance and the hammer of Hunnic expansion. As the 4th century gave way to the 5th, as the old millennium approached its end, the world held its breath. Change was coming, carried on the hoofbeats of horses from the eastern steppes. The age of Attila was about to begin, and with it, the final transformation of the ancient world into something new and strange and terrible. In this moment of historical tension, when the old order was dying and the new had yet to be born, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic performances. Beyond the eastern horizon where the sun first touches the world each morning, beyond the known territories of Roman maps and Persian chronicles, stretched the vast ocean of grass that would birth the most feared conqueror of the ancient world. The Eurasian steppe, that endless expanse of windswept prairie, extending from the Carpathian Mountains to the walls of China, had always been a crucible of peoples, a forge where nomadic nations were born and tempered in the harsh rhythms of seasonal migration and tribal warfare. From this immense grassland, wave after wave of horse-riding peoples had emerged throughout history, each leaving their mark upon the settled civilizations that bordered the steppe's edges. The Scythians had come first, their gold-adorned warriors becoming the stuff of Greek legend. The Sarmatians followed, their heavy cavalry inspiring Roman military reforms. The Alans would ride west to Spain and Africa. Now, as the 4th century drew toward its close, the steppe was preparing to unleash its most devastating progeny upon a world already trembling with change. The Huns emerged from this primordial grassland like figures from a half-remembered dream, their origins shrouded in the mists of unrecorded history. No Hun scribe chronicled their early years. No Hun historian preserved their ancient songs and stories. What we know of their beginnings comes filtered through the accounts of their enemies, distorted by fear and incomprehension, fragmented like shards of a broken mirror that can never quite reflect the whole truth. Yet modern scholarship, aided by archaeology and genetics, has begun to piece together the puzzle of Hunnic origins. The most compelling theory connects them to the Xiongnu, that great confederation of nomadic tribes that had terrorized China for centuries, prompting the construction of the Great Wall and the development of Chinese defensive strategies that would influence military thinking for millennia. These Xiongnu, according to Chinese records, were a diverse coalition of steppe peoples, united under ambitious leaders, who transformed scattered tribal raids into coordinated campaigns of conquest. The parallels between Xiongnu and Hun are striking. Both were composite nomadic empires that absorbed conquered peoples while maintaining a distinct elite identity. Both excelled at mounted archery and utilized similar tactical approaches. Both demonstrated an unusual ability to unite diverse tribal groups under centralized leadership. Most intriguingly, genetic studies of European populations with claimed Hunnic ancestry show markers consistent with East Asian origins, supporting the theory of a migration from Mongolia westward across the steppe. But the journey from the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Hungary was neither direct nor simple. The Huns who appeared in European consciousness in the late 4th century were already a transformed people, their original identity overlaid with generations of cultural exchange and biological mixing. Like a river that begins as a mountain stream and becomes something entirely different by the time it reaches the sea, the Hunnic Confederation had absorbed influences from dozens of conquered peoples during its westward migration. The steppe itself shaped these peoples in profound ways. Life on the grasslands demanded mobility, adaptability, and a warrior culture that could respond instantly to threats and opportunities. The harsh winters and scorching summers of the continental interior bred a hardy people accustomed to extremes, capable of enduring hardships that would break settled populations. The vast distances between water sources and grazing areas fostered skills in navigation, weather reading, and animal husbandry that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Horses were the foundation of steppe civilization, and no people mastered the art of horsemanship more completely than the Huns. From earliest childhood, Hun children learned to ride before they could walk steadily, developing an almost centauric relationship with their mounts that astonished and terrified their enemies. Roman accounts describe Hun warriors who seemed incapable of walking normally, so completely had they adapted to life in the saddle. The composite bow, that masterpiece of steppe engineering, was the primary weapon of Hun warfare. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together with animal glue, these bows were compact enough to be used effectively from horseback, yet powerful enough to penetrate armor at considerable distances. A skilled Hun archer could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, turning retreat into attack and making pursuit a deadly gamble for enemies. But the Huns were more than just accomplished horse soldiers. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated material culture that belies the simple barbarian stereotype propagated by their enemies. Hun metalworkers created jewelry and weapons of extraordinary beauty, their techniques showing influences from across Eurasia. Hun leatherworkers produced saddles, harnesses, and clothing adapted perfectly to their nomadic lifestyle. Hun women wove textiles that combined practical durability with artistic excellence. The religious life of the Huns remains largely mysterious, hidden behind the veil of time and the bias of Christian chroniclers who saw only paganism where they looked. Yet fragments of evidence suggest a complex spiritual world centered on shamanic practices and the worship of sky gods. The Huns appear to have practiced divination through the examination of animal entrails and the observation of natural phenomena. They honored the spirits of ancestors and the forces of nature that governed the steppe. Their burial practices, revealed through archaeology, show both reverence for the dead and belief in an afterlife, where warriors would ride eternal hunts across celestial grasslands. Into this world of wind and grass, of horses and arrows, of shamanic visions and ancestral spirits, the future scourge of God was born. The exact date of Attila's birth remains unknown, lost in the absence of written records and the passage of centuries. Most scholars place it around 400, making him a child of the new century that would witness the final transformation of the ancient world. His name, Attila, may derive from the Gothic word for little father, suggesting perhaps that he was born into a family of some standing within the mixed Gothic Hunnic society of the Pontic Steppe. Alternatively, it might come from the Hunnic word for iron, indicating a hope that this child would grow to possess the strength and durability of that most precious of metals. Like so much about his early life, the meaning of his name remains a mystery, wrapped in linguistic speculation and historical uncertainty. What we know with greater certainty is that Attila was born into a world in transition. His uncles, Rua and Octa, were already emerging as leaders of the Hunnic Confederation, uniting previously fractious tribes under their joint authority. The collapse of Gothic power north of the Black Sea had created a vacuum that the Huns were eager to fill. But this expansion brought new challenges and opportunities that would shape the young Attila's understanding of leadership and power. The Hunnic society into which Attila was born was remarkably egalitarian compared to the rigid hierarchies of Roman or Persian civilization. While leadership was often hereditary, it was also merit-based, with successful war leaders rising to positions of authority regardless of their birth. This meritocratic element meant that even royal children like Attila had to prove themselves through deed rather than relying solely on bloodline. The education of a young Hun prince was unlike anything available in the civilized world. While Roman boys of noble families studied rhetoric and philosophy, Attila learned the arts of war and diplomacy from masters who had spent their lives in the saddle. He mastered the use of the composite bow, the lance, and the curved sword that were the traditional weapons of the steppe. He learned to read weather patterns, to find water in seemingly barren landscape, to judge the condition of horses with a glance. More importantly, Attila learned the complex art of managing a nomadic confederation. The Huns were not a unified people in the way that Romans understood ethnicity, but rather a political association of diverse tribes and clans held together by shared leadership and common purpose. Keeping such a coalition united required diplomatic skills of the highest order, the ability to balance competing interests and mediate disputes that could fragment the confederation. If mishandled, the young Attila would have witnessed his uncles navigating these challenges, observing how they used a combination of generosity and intimidation to maintain their authority. Successful raids brought wealth that could be distributed to followers, buying loyalty through the ancient logic of the warband. Unsuccessful leaders found themselves abandoned or challenged, their followers drifting away to join more promising chiefs. Language was another crucial element of Attila's education. The polyglot nature of the Hunnic Confederation meant that effective leaders needed to communicate with Gothic vassals, Alan allies, and Roman diplomats. Attila appears to have mastered not only his native Hunnic tongue but also Gothic, Latin, and possibly Greek, skills that would prove invaluable in his later negotiations with the Roman Empire. The shamanic traditions of the Huns also played a role in shaping the young prince's worldview. While the specific details of his religious upbringing remain hidden, it seems likely that Attila was taught to see himself as more than merely a political leader. In steppe tradition, great Khans were often viewed as intermediaries between the earthly and spiritual realms, blessed by the sky god with the mandate to rule. This quasi-divine status would later manifest in Attila's dealings with enemies who often seemed genuinely awed by his presence. Physical descriptions of Attila, recorded by Roman ambassadors who met him in his prime, suggest a man of typically East Asian appearance. He was reportedly short and stocky, with a large head, small eyes, and a sparse beard. His complexion was dark, and his bearing suggested the confidence of one accustomed to absolute obedience. Yet these same accounts note that despite his unremarkable appearance, Attila possessed a magnetic presence that commanded attention and inspired both devotion and terror. The dual kingship of his uncles provided young Attila with a practical education in the complexities of shared leadership. Rua and Okta appear to have divided their responsibilities along geographical lines, with one focusing on eastern territories and relations with the Byzantines, while the other managed western affairs and dealt with the Germanic tribes. This division of labor allowed them to respond more effectively to threats and opportunities across their vast domain, while providing redundancy in case one ruler was killed or incapacitated. Attila's co-rulership with his brother Bleda, which would begin after the death of their uncles, followed this same pattern. The arrangement allowed the Hunnic Confederation to pursue multiple objectives simultaneously while maintaining unified strategic direction. Yet it also contained the seeds of future conflict, as ambitious personalities rarely content themselves with shared power indefinitely. The military education of a Hun prince extended far beyond individual combat skills to encompass the grand strategy of steppe warfare. Attila learned to think in terms of mobility and surprise, of striking where enemies were weak and avoiding where they were strong. He mastered the art of the feigned retreat, that classic steppe tactic that lured pursuing enemies into ambushes or separated them from their supply lines. Logistics, often overlooked in romantic accounts of nomadic warfare, formed a crucial part of Attila's military education. Managing the movement and supply of tens of thousands of warriors and their families across vast distances required organizational skills of the highest order. The Huns had to coordinate the availability of grazing for their horses with the location of water sources and the timing of military campaigns. They needed to maintain their equipment in the field, replace losses, and integrate new recruits from conquered peoples. The integration of conquered peoples was itself a complex art that Attila observed and eventually mastered. Unlike the Romans, who sought to transform conquered populations into Romans, the Huns maintained a more flexible approach that allowed subject peoples to retain their cultural identities while serving Hunnic strategic objectives. Gothic nobles became Hun vassals, Alan warriors joined Hun armies, and Sarmatian metalworkers supplied Hun weapons, all while maintaining their distinct ethnic identities. This inclusive approach to empire building was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed the Huns to rapidly expand their power by incorporating rather than destroying existing political structures. Yet it also meant that the confederation was held together more by personal loyalty and shared success than by cultural unity or institutional permanence. When Attila eventually died, this weakness would prove fatal to the Hunnic Empire. The diplomatic traditions of the steppe also shaped Attila's understanding of international relations. Steppe diplomacy was notably pragmatic, based on mutual advantage, rather than ideological compatibility. Alliances were formed and broken based on changing circumstances, and personal relationships between leaders often mattered more than formal treaties. This approach would serve Attila well in his later dealings with both halves of the Roman Empire, as he proved adept at playing east against west and exploiting the internal divisions of his enemies. Trade was another element of steppe life that influenced Attila's development. The Great Silk Road that connected China with the Mediterranean passed through territories controlled or influenced by nomadic peoples, and the Huns were well positioned to profit from this commerce. Control of trade routes provided both wealth and strategic leverage, as disrupting commerce could be used to pressure sedentary powers while protecting it could buy goodwill and political support. The seasonal rhythms of nomadic life also shaped Attila's strategic thinking. Unlike settled peoples who conducted military campaigns according to political calendars, the Huns were governed by the natural cycles of the steppe. Spring brought new grass for the horses and favorable weather for long-distance travel. Summer offered the best campaigning conditions, but also the greatest demand on grazing resources. Autumn was the time for final raids before winter, when the Confederation would scatter to winter quarters. This seasonal pattern would later be reflected in Attila's campaigns against the Roman Empire. His major offensives typically began in spring and reached their climax in summer, with negotiations and withdrawals often coming with the approach of winter. Understanding these natural rhythms gave Attila strategic advantages over Roman commanders who thought in terms of fixed campaigning seasons and permanent territorial occupation. As Attila reached maturity in the early decades of the 5th century, the Hunnic Confederation was entering a new phase of its development. The initial period of conquest and expansion was giving way to the more complex challenges of governing a multi-ethnic empire and managing relations with powerful neighbors. The skills that had sufficed for tribal leadership were no longer adequate for the responsibilities of ruling peoples who numbered in the hundreds of thousands and controlling territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The death of his uncles around 434 brought Attila and his brother Bleda to joint leadership of the Hunnic Confederation at a crucial moment in its history. The Eastern Roman Empire was showing signs of renewed strength under capable leadership, while internal divisions in the Western Empire presented opportunities for expansion. The Germanic kingdoms that had emerged from the ruins of Roman authority were still fragmented and vulnerable, yet they were also learning to cooperate against common threats. Into this complex strategic environment, the brothers brought different but complementary strengths. Bleda appears to have been the more traditional steppe leader, focused on maintaining the internal cohesion of the Confederation and managing relations with vassal peoples. Attila showed early signs of the broader vision that would later make him famous, demonstrating an understanding of Roman politics and Byzantine diplomacy that suggested ambitions extending far beyond traditional nomadic objectives. The partnership between the brothers would last for more than a decade, during which the Hunnic Confederation reached new heights of power and influence. Yet beneath the surface of cooperation, tensions were building that would eventually lead to the elimination of Bleda and Attila's emergence as sole ruler of the Huns. The stage was being set for the final act of the drama that would make Attila's name synonymous with the wrath of God and the terror of civilized peoples. In these formative years, as he learned the arts of war and diplomacy, leadership and statecraft, the future scourge of God was unknowingly preparing for a role that would reshape the ancient world. The boy born on the windswept steppes would grow into the man who would humble emperors and topple kingdoms, who would be remembered long after his empire had crumbled into dust. But that transformation still lay ahead, waiting in the uncertain future like storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon. The year 445 marked a turning point in the annals of barbarian history, a moment when the delicate balance of shared power that had governed the Hunnic Confederation for more than a decade finally shattered. Bleda, co-ruler of the Huns and brother to Attila, met his end in circumstances that remained shrouded in mystery and diplomatic silence. The official accounts, such as they are, speak vaguely of natural causes or hunting accidents. Yet those who understood the ruthless logic of steppe politics suspected a darker truth. The death of Bleda was not merely the passing of one leader among many, but the consolidation of absolute authority in the hands of a man whose ambitions had already begun to outgrow the traditional bounds of nomadic kingship. Attila, no longer constrained by the need to share power or accommodate a brother's different vision, emerged from this family tragedy as the undisputed master of the most formidable military confederation Europe had seen since the days of Alexander. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Where the dual kingship had necessitated compromise and consultation, Attila's sole rule brought swift decision-making and unified command. The scattered tribes and vassal peoples of the Hunnic Empire, previously pulled in different directions by competing loyalties, now felt the full force of a single will, directing their collective power toward objectives that grew bolder with each passing season. The first target of this newly concentrated authority was the Eastern Roman Empire, that glittering remnant of ancient glory that ruled from the Golden Dome of Constantinople. The Byzantines, as they were coming to be known, had grown comfortable with their tributary relationship to the Huns, viewing the annual payments of gold as a reasonable price for peace along their northern frontiers. They had failed to recognize that their barbarian neighbors were no longer content with mere tribute, but hungered for something far more substantial. Attila's opening gambit against Constantinople revealed the sophisticated understanding of Roman politics that would become his trademark. Rather than simply launching raids across the Danube, he chose to exploit a diplomatic incident that gave his aggression the veneer of justified retaliation. A Hun leader serving under Byzantine authority had been executed for treason, and Attila demanded not only compensation but also the surrender of those responsible for his kinsman's death. The Byzantine response to these demands demonstrated the fatal combination of arrogance and weakness that characterized the Eastern Empire in its dealings with barbarian powers. Emperor Theodosius II, ruling from the safety of his palace walls, dismissed Attila's threats as the empty bluster of an ignorant savage. The Roman court, insulated from frontier realities by layers of bureaucracy and ceremonial protocol, could not conceive that their ancient empire might truly be vulnerable to barbarian assault. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. In 441, Attila unleashed the full fury of the Hunnic war machine against the unprepared provinces of the Eastern Empire. The invasion that followed was unlike anything the Romans had experienced since the dark days of the 3rd century crisis. Where previous barbarian raids had been essentially glorified cattle-rustling expeditions, Attila's campaign bore all the hallmarks of systematic conquest. The Hunnic army that crossed the Danube frontier was a marvel of steppe military organization, a polyglot host that reflected the diverse peoples now united under Attila's banner. At its core rode the Huns themselves, those master horsemen whose composite bows and tactical mobility had terrorized enemies from China to Gaul. Around this nucleus were arrayed the Gothic cavalry, Gepid infantry, Alan lancers, and contingents from a dozen other subject peoples, each contributing their specialized skills to the common cause. The scale of this invasion dwarfed previous Hunnic incursions into Roman territory. Contemporary sources suggest that Attila led perhaps 70,000 warriors across the Danube, supported by an even larger number of camp followers, siege specialists, and auxiliary troops. This was not a raiding party, but a migrating nation, a human flood that swept across the Balkan Peninsula with irresistible force. The cities of Thrace and Moesia, those prosperous trading centers that had grown fat on the commerce flowing between Constantinople and the barbarian lands beyond the frontier, found themselves defenseless against this onslaught. Attila had learned from previous campaigns that siege warfare, traditionally the weakness of nomadic armies, could be mastered through the systematic application of Roman techniques adapted to Hunnic purposes. The fate of Nisus, modern Niš in Serbia, became emblematic of Attila's new approach to warfare. This fortified city, birthplace of Constantine the Great, had withstood numerous barbarian assaults over the centuries. Its walls were strong, its garrison experienced, its citizens confident in their ability to outlast another nomadic raid. They could not have been more wrong. Attila's siege of Nasus revealed the extent to which the Huns had evolved beyond their nomadic origins. The attacking forces employed sophisticated siege engines, including battering rams, catapults, and mobile towers that would not have been out of place in a Roman army. Gothic and Gepid engineers, working under Hunnic direction, demonstrated that the barbarians had learned to match Roman technical expertise while retaining their advantages in mobility and tactical innovation. The systematic devastation that followed the fall of Nasus sent shockwaves throughout the Eastern Empire. Attila was no longer content merely to plunder and withdraw, as his predecessors had done. Instead, he seemed determined to demonstrate that no Roman settlement, no matter how strongly fortified or strategically located, was safe from his wrath. City after city fell to his advancing host, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their treasures added to the growing wealth of the Hunnic war chest. The psychological impact of these victories was perhaps even more significant than their material consequences. For generations, Romans had comforted themselves with the belief that their superior civilization made them ultimately invulnerable to barbarian conquest. Individual battles might be lost, territories might be temporarily overrun, but in the end, Roman discipline and organization would always triumph over barbarian chaos. Attila's campaigns shattered this comfortable delusion. Here was a barbarian leader who could match Roman strategic thinking, while exceeding Roman tactical flexibility. His armies combined the mobility of the steppe with the staying power of settled peoples. His intelligence network rivaled that of the imperial government. His diplomatic skills enabled him to exploit Roman internal divisions with devastating effectiveness. The advance toward Constantinople itself demonstrated Attila's grasp of strategic psychology. Rather than rushing directly toward the capital, he methodically reduced the network of fortified cities that protected the approaches to the imperial city. Each victory brought fresh recruits to his banner, as local populations chose collaboration over destruction. Each defeat inflicted on Roman forces eroded imperial prestige and encouraged further defections. The Emperor Theodosius, watching his empire crumble from behind the walls of his capital, found himself facing a choice between catastrophic defeat and humiliating negotiation. The proud heir of Augustus and Constantine was reduced to sending embassies to a barbarian chieftain, pleading for terms that might preserve what remained of Roman dignity. The negotiations that followed revealed Attila's mastery of diplomatic as well as military pressure. He understood that the Byzantines valued their gold almost as much as their lives, and he crafted demands that would drain the imperial treasury while establishing permanent mechanisms for future exploitation. The tribute he extracted was not merely payment for his current campaign, but recognition of his status as an equal to the Roman emperor. The Treaty of Anatolius, negotiated in 443, established terms that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. The Eastern Empire agreed to pay an immediate lump sum of £6,000 of gold, followed by an annual tribute of £2,100. Roman territory south of the Danube was ceded to Hunnic control, creating a buffer zone that effectively moved the imperial frontier hundreds of miles south of its traditional line. Perhaps most humiliatingly, the treaty required the Romans to surrender all Hun deserters and refugees who had sought asylum within the empire. These unfortunates, many of whom had fled Attila's increasingly authoritarian rule, were handed over to face certain death or slavery. The sight of Roman officials delivering their own allies to barbarian vengeance struck at the very foundations of imperial honor and reliability. The personal character of Attila began to emerge more clearly during these negotiations. Roman ambassadors who met him in his camp were struck by the contrast between his simple personal habits and the elaborate protocol that surrounded his court. He dressed plainly, ate simple foods, and drank from wooden cups while his subordinates displayed the wealth of conquered provinces in gold and silk. This calculated simplicity served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Attila's confidence in his own authority, showing that he needed no external trappings to command respect. It appealed to traditional steppe values that prized authentic leadership over ceremonial display. Most importantly, it unsettled Roman diplomats who expected barbarian chieftains to be either crudely ostentatious or primitively simple. but not this sophisticated combination of both. The court that surrounded Attila reflected the cosmopolitan nature of his empire. Gothic nobles served as his advisors, Roman defectors managed his correspondence, Greek intellectuals provided strategic counsel, and Alan warriors commanded his bodyguard. This mixture of cultures and languages created an atmosphere unlike anything in the traditional Roman or Persian courts, a unique synthesis that drew strength from diversity. Onegesius, Attila's chief minister, exemplified this cultural fusion. Born a Roman citizen but risen to high rank in Hunnic service, he served as interpreter not merely of languages but of civilizations. Through men like Onegesius, Attila gained insights into Roman psychology and Byzantine politics that proved invaluable in his diplomatic and military campaigns. The administrative structure that governed Attila's expanding empire was a remarkable adaptation of steppe traditions to the requirements of ruling sedentary populations. Unlike the Romans, who imposed uniform administrative structures across their territories, or the Persians, who maintained rigid hierarchical control, Attila developed a flexible system that accommodated the diverse traditions of his subjects while maintaining effective central authority. Local rulers were permitted to retain their traditional titles and customs, provided they acknowledged Attila's supremacy and contributed to his military campaigns. This approach minimized resistance while maximizing the resources available for future expansion. Gothic kings became Hunnic vassals. Alan chieftains served as Hunnic generals, and Roman cities found themselves governed by Hunnic administrators, who often proved more competent than their former imperial officials. The economic foundations of Attila's empire were as sophisticated as its political structures. The tribute extracted from Byzantium provided a steady flow of gold and silver that could be used to reward loyal followers and purchase the services of skilled craftsmen and warriors. Control of trade routes across Central Europe generated additional revenue while providing strategic intelligence about the movements and intentions of potential enemies. The integration of agricultural populations within Hunnic territory created new challenges and opportunities. Unlike purely nomadic societies that could simply drive their herds to new pastures when local resources were exhausted, Attila now ruled over farmers and craftsmen whose prosperity depended on stable conditions and effective governance. This responsibility required a level of administrative sophistication that went far beyond traditional steppe leadership. The military innovations that emerged during this period reflected Attila's genius for combining different tactical traditions into new synthetic approaches. Hun horse archers provided the mobile striking power that could shatter enemy formations and exploit breakthrough opportunities. Gothic heavy cavalry delivered the concentrated shock action needed to complete victories initiated by more mobile forces. Gepid and Alan infantry provided the staying power required for siege warfare and territorial occupation. The siege techniques developed under Attila's direction represented a revolutionary advance in barbarian military capabilities. Previous nomadic leaders had been forced to avoid fortified positions or rely on treachery and surprise to overcome defensive advantages. Attila's armies could now conduct systematic sieges using equipment and techniques that rivaled anything available to Roman engineers. The psychological warfare that accompanied Attila's military campaigns was equally sophisticated. The reputation for merciless treatment of enemies who resisted, combined with generous terms for those who submitted, created powerful incentives for early surrender. Cities that opened their gates might expect to preserve their lives and property. Those that forced Attila to conduct lengthy sieges faced complete destruction. This carefully calibrated approach to violence served strategic as well as tactical purposes. The terror inspired by accounts of Attila's vengeance traveled faster than his armies, preparing the way for future campaigns by undermining enemy morale and encouraging defections. Yet the reliability of his promises to those who cooperated maintained channels for negotiation and surrender that purely destructive approaches would have closed. The personal relationship between Attila and his warriors reflected the traditional steppe emphasis on charismatic leadership and personal loyalty. Unlike Roman commanders who relied primarily on institutional authority and professional discipline, Attila maintained the allegiance of his followers through a combination of military success, personal courage, and generous distribution of captured wealth. This personal approach to leadership created both strengths and vulnerabilities in Attila's system of rule. His presence on the battlefield inspired extraordinary efforts from his followers and struck terror into his enemies. His personal involvement in negotiations gave him flexibility and authority that institutional representatives could not match. Yet this same personalization of authority meant that his entire empire depended on his individual capacity and lifespan in ways that more institutionalized systems did not. The religious and cultural dimensions of Attila's leadership reflected the syncretic nature of steppe spirituality. While maintaining traditional Hun shamanic practices, he also incorporated elements from the various religions of his subject peoples. This inclusive approach strengthened his authority over diverse populations while preserving the mystical aura that steppe peoples expected from their supreme leaders. The portents and omens that surrounded Attila's rise to sole power were carefully cultivated to enhance his legendary status. Shamanic rituals confirmed his divine favor, while practical successes provided evidence of supernatural support. This combination of spiritual authority and temporal achievement created a leadership style that resonated across cultural boundaries while maintaining distinctively Hunnic characteristics. As the fourth decade of the 5th century drew toward its close, Attila stood at the pinnacle of barbarian achievement. His empire stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. His treasury overflowed with Byzantine gold, and his reputation struck terror into the hearts of his enemies from Scandinavia to North Africa. Yet this was merely the foundation for greater ambitions that would soon turn his attention toward the weaker but more prestigious Western Roman Empire. The stage was now set for the confrontation that would define Attila's historical legacy and determine the fate of Roman civilization in the West. The scourge of God had awakened to his full power, and the ancient world trembled before the storm that was gathering on the eastern horizon. The boy from the steppes had become the master of nations, and his greatest triumphs still lay ahead in the uncertain future that would make his name immortal. In the smoky dimness of his great timber hall, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of a dozen conquered peoples, Attila held court like no ruler the world had ever seen. The year was 449, and the man who had emerged from the windswept steppes as a nomadic prince now commanded an empire that stretched from the shores of the Baltic Sea to the mountains of the Caucasus. Yet for all his power, for all the terror his name inspired from Constantinople to Ravenna, Attila remained in many ways an enigma, a figure whose true nature was as difficult to grasp as smoke in a winter wind. The Roman ambassador Priscus, whose detailed account of his embassy to Attila's court provides our most intimate glimpse into the world of the Hun king, arrived to find a civilization unlike anything in his previous experience. Here was neither the marble splendor of Rome nor the golden magnificence of Constantinople, but something entirely new, a synthesis of nomadic tradition and imperial ambition that defied the conventional categories by which civilized men understood power and authority. Attila's royal compound, established in the Hungarian plains near the Tisa River, was a marvel of organized complexity, despite its deceptively simple appearance. The Great Hall itself was constructed entirely of timber, its massive beams hewn from the primeval forests of Carpathia, and fitted together with a precision that would have impressed Roman architects. The building rose from the grassland like a monument to the marriage of nomadic mobility and settled permanence, its peaked roof crowned with the carved heads of horses and wolves that proclaimed its steppe origins to any who might doubt them. Yet it was not the architecture that most impressed visitors to Attila's court, but the extraordinary mixture of peoples and cultures that gathered there. Gothic nobles in their finest war gear conversed with Roman exiles who had found new careers in Hunnic service. Alan chieftains wearing the gold torques of their ancestors shared benches with Gepid warriors whose ancestors had fought against the legions of Marcus Aurelius. Greek scholars fleeing the theological controversies of Constantinople found themselves translating diplomatic correspondence for a barbarian king who spoke their language better than many of their former imperial patrons. This cosmopolitan atmosphere reflected Attila's genius for recognizing and utilizing talent regardless of its origins. Onegesius, his chief minister and closest advisor, was himself a Roman by birth, who had chosen service with the Huns over the declining prospects of imperial bureaucracy. Through men like Onegesius, Attila gained access to the administrative expertise that had built the Roman Empire, while maintaining the flexibility and decisiveness that Roman bureaucracy had largely abandoned. The daily routine of this barbarian emperor revealed a man of remarkable self-discipline and calculated simplicity, while his followers adorned themselves with the golden treasures extracted from Byzantine tribute and Gothic tribute. Attila himself maintained an almost ascetic lifestyle that both honored his nomadic heritage and demonstrated his confidence in his own authority. He dressed in simple woolen garments, ate plain food from wooden vessels, and drank fermented mare's milk from the same clay cups his ancestors had used on the open steppes. This deliberate modesty served multiple purposes in the complex political ecology of the Hunnic court. It demonstrated to his own people that success had not corrupted their leader's essential character. It confused and unsettled Roman diplomats who expected barbarian chiefs to be either primitively simple or ostentatiously wealthy, but not this sophisticated combination of both. Most importantly, it freed Attila from the need to compete with his subordinates in displays of material wealth, allowing him to channel resources toward military and political objectives rather than ceremonial extravagance. The intellectual life of Attila's court was perhaps its most remarkable feature, challenging every assumption about barbarian capacity for learning and cultural achievement. The king himself was not merely multilingual, but genuinely learned, capable of discussing Roman law with trained jurists, debating theological questions with Christian bishops, and analyzing military treatises with professional soldiers. His library, maintained by Greek and Roman secretaries, contained works on history, philosophy, and statecraft that would not have been out of place in the imperial palace at Constantinople. Yet this intellectual sophistication was always balanced by the practical wisdom of the steppes. Attila's decisions were informed by careful study of precedent and theory, but they were made with the speed and decisiveness that nomadic leadership required. He could spend hours in scholarly discussion of the finer points of Roman constitutional law, then issue military orders that set tens of thousands of men in motion across hundreds of miles of territory. The marriage politics of Attila's court reflected both his personal appetites and his strategic understanding of alliance building through kinship ties. Unlike Roman emperors who typically married for dynastic reasons within a narrow circle of aristocratic families, Attila took wives from across the spectrum of his subject peoples. These marriages served to bind local elites to his regime, while providing him with intimate knowledge of the internal affairs of potentially rebellious communities. His principal wife, Krika, was herself a Hun of noble lineage whose family had served his ancestors for generations. She managed the domestic affairs of the royal household and bore him several sons who would play crucial roles in the succession struggles that followed his death. Yet Attila's other marriages were clearly political arrangements designed to cement alliances and demonstrate his mastery over conquered peoples. The children of these various unions formed a considerable cohort of potential heirs whose competing claims would eventually contribute to the fragmentation of the Hunnic Empire. Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak, the sons of Kreka, were raised in the traditional Hun manner to be warriors and leaders. The children of his other wives received educations appropriate to their mothers' cultures, creating a diverse group of potential successors with different skills and loyalties. Family life in the royal compound reflected the same mixture of nomadic tradition and imperial adaptation that characterized every aspect of Attila's rule. The women of the household maintained many of the domestic crafts that had been practiced on the steppes for generations, weaving textiles and preparing foods according to ancient recipes. Yet they also supervised the work of slaves and servants drawn from across the known world, managed correspondence in multiple languages, and participated in the diplomatic receptions that were an essential part of imperial governance. The religious life of Attila's court was similarly syncretic, combining traditional Hun shamanism with elements drawn from the various faiths of his subject peoples. The king himself appears to have maintained a pragmatic approach to supernatural matters, honoring the sky god of his ancestors, while showing respect for the Christian beliefs of his Roman subjects and the Germanic deities worshipped by his Gothic vassals. Shamanic rituals continued to play an important role in major decisions, with divination through animal entrails and the observation of natural omens influencing military and political choices. Yet Attila also consulted with Christian bishops and pagan philosophers, seeking advice from whatever sources might provide useful guidance. This religious flexibility was typical of steppe leaders, who valued practical effectiveness over theological consistency. The court ceremonies that marked important occasions in the Hunnic calendar blended elements from multiple traditions into new synthetic forms. Victory celebrations combined traditional Hun horse races and archery contests with Gothic feast customs and Roman theatrical performances. Diplomatic receptions incorporated steppe hospitality traditions with the protocol requirements of international relations. Marriage ceremonies honored the customs of all parties involved, while establishing new precedents for future royal unions. The economic foundations of this remarkable court rested on the systematic exploitation of multiple revenue sources that reflected the diverse nature of Attila's empire. The tribute extracted from the Eastern Roman Empire provided a steady flow of gold and silver that formed the foundation of royal wealth. Control of trade routes across Central Europe generated additional income from customs duties and protection fees charged to merchant caravans. The agricultural production of settled territories within the Hunnic domain contributed grain, livestock, and manufactured goods that supported the large population of the royal compound. The traditional nomadic economy of herding and raiding continued to provide horses, leather goods, and additional wealth from successful military campaigns. The integration of these diverse economic systems required administrative skills that went far beyond traditional steppe leadership. Craftsmen from across the known world found employment in Attila's service, their skills contributing to the material prosperity of the court, while producing the weapons and luxury goods needed for diplomatic and military purposes. Hun metalworkers had always been skilled, but under Attila's patronage they learned techniques from Roman, Gothic, and Persian masters that elevated their craftsmanship to new levels of sophistication. The diplomatic protocols of Attila's court reflected his understanding of the psychological dimensions of international relations. Foreign ambassadors were received with carefully choreographed ceremonies designed to demonstrate Hunnic power while respecting the dignity of their home nations. Roman envoys might find themselves sharing meals with Gothic nobles who had once been their enemies, a subtle reminder of how completely the old order had been transformed. The language of diplomacy at Attila's court was necessarily polyglot, with negotiations conducted in whatever tongue was most convenient for the participants. Attila himself served as translator when his personal involvement was required, demonstrating his mastery of Latin, Greek, and Gothic, in addition to his native Hunnic tongue. This linguistic flexibility gave him significant advantages in international negotiations, as he could often understand conversations that his counterparts assumed were private. The intelligence network that served Attila's diplomatic and military needs was remarkably sophisticated, drawing information from Roman deserters, Gothic nobles, merchant travelers, and religious pilgrims, who moved freely across the porous boundaries of 5th century Europe. This network provided early warning of potential threats and opportunities, while supplying the detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities and intentions that informed Hunnic strategic planning. Military councils at Attila's court brought together the most experienced warriors from across his empire to plan campaigns and evaluate threats. Hun cavalry commanders shared their expertise in mobile warfare with Gothic specialists in siege techniques and Allan masters of heavy cavalry combat. This synthesis of military traditions produced tactical innovations that consistently surprised and defeated enemies who expected barbarian armies to rely solely on traditional nomadic methods. The training of young warriors reflected the same synthetic approach that characterized every aspect of Attila's rule. Hun princes learned traditional horsemanship and archery alongside Gothic swordsmanship and Roman engineering. The sons of vassal kings received educations that prepared them to serve as officers in Hunnic armies, while maintaining their roles as leaders of their own peoples. The legal system that governed Attila's diverse subjects was necessarily flexible, accommodating the different traditions and customs of various ethnic groups, while maintaining overall unity of purpose. Hun customary law governed disputes between nomadic peoples, while Gothic and Roman legal traditions were applied to settled populations according to their ancestral customs. This pluralistic approach minimized friction, while ensuring that all subjects understood their rights and obligations. The succession arrangements that Attila established reflected his understanding of the challenges facing any personal empire built around charismatic leadership. Rather than naming a single heir, he made provisions for his various sons to inherit different portions of his domain according to their capabilities and the nature of their subjects. This approach was designed to prevent the civil wars that had destroyed previous steppe empires, while maintaining overall coordination among related rulers. The personal character of Attila that emerges from contemporary accounts is complex and often contradictory, reflecting both the genuinely puzzling nature of his personality and the biases of sources who viewed him through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. Roman writers emphasized his cruelty and barbarism while grudgingly acknowledging his intelligence and effectiveness. Gothic accounts praised his generosity and justice, while noting his ruthless treatment of enemies. The physical presence that Attila projected was itself a carefully cultivated aspect of his authority. Despite his unremarkable stature and typically Asian features, contemporary accounts universally note the magnetic quality of his presence and the fear he inspired in both followers and enemies. This aura of authority was undoubtedly partly natural charisma, but it was also the result of careful attention to the theatrical aspects of leadership. The daily schedule that governed Attila's activities reflected the complex demands of ruling an empire that spanned multiple time zones and encompassed dozens of different peoples. Morning councils dealt with immediate military and administrative issues. Midday receptions provided opportunities for diplomatic contacts and ceremonial functions. Evening hours were reserved for planning sessions and private consultations with key advisors. The private moments of this public figure remain largely hidden from historical view, but occasional glimpses suggest a man capable of genuine affection for his family and close associates. His grief at the death of his eldest son appears to have been sincere and profound. His loyalty to old friends and advisors who had served him faithfully was notable even by the standards of personal honor that governed steppe society. The intellectual curiosity that drove Attila's interest in Roman law and Christian theology seems to have been genuine rather than merely instrumental. He appears to have taken real pleasure in philosophical discussions and to have valued learning for its own sake, as well as for its practical applications. This scholarly side of his nature provided a counterpoint to his reputation as a destroyer of civilizations and suggests depths of character that his enemies preferred not to acknowledge. As the decade of the 440s drew toward its close, Attila's court had become the most cosmopolitan and intellectually sophisticated in Europe, a remarkable achievement for a man whose grandparents had lived in felt tents on the open steppes. Yet this cultural flowering was built on foundations of military conquest and political intimidation that required constant vigilance and periodic demonstration to maintain. The king who discussed philosophy with Roman scholars was the same man who had reduced dozens of cities to ash and enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. This duality, perhaps more than any single characteristic, defined the man who had become the terror of the civilized world, while creating a court culture that rivaled anything in the traditional centers of learning and power. The boy from the steppes had grown into something unprecedented in human history, a barbarian intellectual whose empire combined nomadic flexibility with settled sophistication in ways that neither Roman nor Persian precedent could explain. The stage was now set for the final act of this extraordinary drama, as Attila's ambitions turned westward toward the weaker but more prestigious Western Roman Empire. The court that had become a beacon of barbarian achievement would soon be tested in the crucible of total war, and the world would discover whether this unprecedented synthesis of cultures could survive the ultimate challenge of its founder's greatest gamble. The threads of fate that would weave themselves into the greatest confrontation of the 5th century began to converge in the imperial palace of Ravenna, where the shadows of declining Roman power cast their gloom across marble corridors that had once echoed with the confident footsteps of absolute authority. It was here, in 450, that a scandal erupted, which would provide Attila with the pretext he had long sought for his greatest and most audacious campaign against the Western Roman Empire. Justa Grata Honoria, sister to the Emperor Valentinian III, was a woman whose ambitions had always exceeded the narrow confines that Roman custom imposed upon imperial females. Intelligent, strong-willed, and possessed of a keen understanding of the political currents that swirled around the throne, she had watched with growing frustration as her younger brother wielded the power that accident of birth had denied to her. In a different age, in a different society, such a woman might have found outlets for her abilities in governance or military command. But in the twilight of the Western Empire, her very existence as an unmarried imperial sister was seen as a problem requiring solution rather than a resource awaiting utilization. The emperor's attempts to neutralize his sister's political potential through marriage to a compliant senator had driven Honoria to desperate measures. Rather than submit to a union that would reduce her from imperial princess to senatorial wife, she chose to commit an act so bold, so unprecedented, that it would alter the course of European history. She sent her ring, along with a message of supplication, to Attila himself, the barbarian king, whose very name struck terror into Roman hearts from Britain to North Africa. The exact contents of Honoria's message remain lost to history, but its implications were clear enough to contemporary observers and to Attila himself. Here was an imperial woman, trapped by the constraints of her society, appealing to the most powerful man in Europe for liberation from an unwanted fate. Whether she intended her appeal as a marriage proposal, a request for political alliance, or simply a desperate cry for help, Attila chose to interpret it in the most expansive possible terms. His response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of Roman politics and psychology that had made him such a formidable opponent of imperial power. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting Honoria's appeal, Attila chose to use it as the foundation for claims that would justify an invasion of unprecedented scope and ambition. If Honoria was appealing to him for protection, he reasoned, then she must be acknowledging him as her rightful husband. If she was his wife, then he was entitled to a dowry appropriate to her imperial status. And what dowry could be more appropriate for the sister of the Western Emperor than half the Western Empire itself? The audacity of these claims reveals both Attila's genius and his growing confidence in his ability to challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which Roman authority rested. No barbarian leader had ever before claimed matrimonial rights to imperial women or hereditary rights to imperial territory. The very suggestion struck at the heart of Roman concepts of legitimacy and civilized order. Yet Attila's previous successes against the Eastern Empire had demonstrated that barbarian claims, however outrageous they might seem, could be enforced through superior military power. The timing of this matrimonial diplomacy was carefully chosen to maximize its political impact. The Western Empire was already struggling with multiple challenges that strained its resources and divided its attention. In North Africa, the Vandal kingdom established by Genseric was disrupting the grain supply that fed Rome and threatening the sea lanes that connected the empire's scattered territories. In Gaul, various Germanic peoples were establishing increasingly independent kingdoms that acknowledged Roman authority only when it suited their immediate interests. In Britain, Saxon settlements were expanding at the expense of Romano-British communities that received little effective support from imperial forces. Into this atmosphere of multiple crises, Attila's matrimonial claims introduced a new dimension of threat that the Western government was ill-equipped to handle. The Emperor Valentinian, never the strongest of rulers, found himself caught between the impossible alternatives of accepting Attila's demands or facing a war that his empire could ill afford. His sister's rash action had created a situation in which any response would be seen as weakness. Yet the resources needed for effective resistance were already committed to other fronts. The man who would bear the primary responsibility for responding to Attila's Western ambitions was Flavius Aetius, the general who had spent the previous 2 decades holding together the fragments of Roman authority in Gaul through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer determination. Aetius was perhaps the last great representative of the Roman military tradition, a commander who had learned his craft in the hard school of frontier warfare and who understood better than any of his contemporaries the realities of 5th century power politics. Yet even Aetius, for all his experience and ability, faced challenges that would have daunted the greatest generals of Rome's golden age. The army at his disposal was no longer the disciplined force of citizen soldiers that had conquered the Mediterranean world, but a polyglot collection of barbarian foederati, Roman regulars, and local militias whose loyalty was often questionable and whose effectiveness varied dramatically with circumstances and leadership. The diplomatic situation that Aetius inherited was equally complex. The Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul had grown strong enough to challenge Roman authority directly, yet remained sufficiently threatened by other barbarian peoples to value Roman alliance when it served their interests. The Burgundians controlled strategic territories in the Rhone Valley, but maintained uncertain relations with both Rome and the various Germanic confederations. The Franks, divided among themselves but increasingly unified under ambitious leaders, represented both potential allies and potential threats depending on the constantly shifting balance of local politics. Meanwhile, from across the Alps, reports arrived of Attila's preparations for what promised to be the greatest barbarian invasion since the Cimbrian Teutones had threatened Rome 5 centuries earlier. The Hunnic Confederation was mobilizing resources on a scale that dwarfed previous campaigns, calling in warriors from subject peoples across Central and Eastern Europe. The Gothic vassals were contributing their heavy cavalry, the Gepids their disciplined infantry, the Alans their skilled horse archers, and dozens of smaller peoples their specialized skills and local knowledge. The intelligence network that served Roman commanders provided fragmentary but alarming reports of this massive mobilization. Scouts reported vast herds of horses being assembled for the campaign, supplies being stockpiled at strategic locations, and siege equipment being constructed under the supervision of Roman deserters and Gothic engineers. The scale of these preparations suggested that Attila intended not merely another raiding expedition but a systematic conquest of Gaul that would establish permanent Hunnic authority over the wealthiest provinces of the Western Empire. The psychological preparation for this invasion was as careful as the material arrangements. Attila's proclamations to his assembled warriors emphasized both the wealth to be won in Gaul and the justice of their cause in championing Honoria's rights against her brother's tyranny. The shamanic rituals that blessed the enterprise were supplemented by Christian prayers from Gothic bishops and pagan sacrifices from Alan priests, creating a religious synthesis that unified the diverse elements of the Hunnic host in common purpose. The strategic objectives of Attila's western campaign evolved as his forces advanced into Gaul during the spring and summer of 451. Initially, the invasion followed the pattern of previous Hunnic campaigns, with rapid advances designed to maximize surprise and minimize enemy preparation time. The crossing of the Rhine was accomplished with characteristic efficiency, catching Roman frontier forces off guard and preventing the organized resistance that might have slowed the invasion's momentum. The systematic devastation that accompanied Attila's advance through eastern Gaul served both practical and psychological purposes. Cities that surrendered promptly were spared destruction and incorporated into the expanding zone of Hunnic control. Those that resisted found themselves subjected to sieges that combined traditional nomadic mobility with sophisticated engineering techniques learned from Roman and Gothic specialists. The fate of these resistant communities served as powerful incentives for others to submit without fighting. The siege of Metz demonstrated the evolution of Hunnic military capabilities since Attila's early campaigns against the Eastern Empire. The city's fortifications, strengthened over generations of barbarian threats, were reduced through the systematic application of siege engines operated by Gothic and Gepid engineers under Hun direction. The fall of such a strongly defended position sent shockwaves throughout Gaul and forced Roman commanders to reconsider their assumptions about barbarian capabilities. Paris, still a relatively modest settlement compared to its future grandeur, was bypassed by Attila's advancing host in favor of more strategically important objectives. This decision reflected the mature strategic thinking that now characterized Hunnic military planning. Rather than becoming bogged down in lengthy sieges of secondary targets, Attila focused his forces on objectives that would maximize political and economic impact, while minimizing the time available for Roman countermeasures. The approach to Orléans marked a turning point in the campaign, as Attila's forces encountered their first serious resistance from a coalition that Aetius had managed to assemble through months of frantic diplomatic activity. The Roman general had recognized that no single power in Gaul possessed sufficient strength to resist Attila alone, but that a confederation of threatened peoples might succeed where individual nations would fail. The alliance that faced Attila outside Orléans was as diverse as his own host, reflecting the complex ethnic and political landscape of 5th century Gaul. Roman regular troops, drawn from garrisons across the province, provided disciplined infantry and experienced leadership. Visigothic cavalry, led by King Theodoric himself, contributed the heavy shock action that could match the striking power of Hun horse archers. Frankish warbands brought their traditional ferocity and local knowledge of terrain. Burgundian forces added their reputation for stubborn defense and skilled metallurgy. The siege of Orléans became the first major test of strength between Attila's evolved military system and the desperate coalition assembled by Attius. The city's fortifications were stronger than those of Metz, its garrison more experienced and better motivated, its strategic position more favorable for defense. The arrival of relief forces under Attius transformed what had been a siege into a field battle, forcing Attila to fight under conditions that did not necessarily favor his traditional tactical preferences. The battle for Orléans revealed both the strengths and limitations of the military systems that had developed during the transformation of the late Roman world. Attila's forces demonstrated their traditional superiority in mobility and archery, using their composite bows to devastating effect against enemy formations, while maintaining the flexibility to respond quickly to changing tactical situations. Yet, the coalition forces showed that determined resistance by disciplined troops fighting on familiar terrain could neutralize many of the advantages that had made the Huns so formidable in previous campaigns. The decision to withdraw from Orléans and seek battle on ground of his own choosing demonstrated Attila's tactical wisdom and strategic flexibility. Rather than becoming committed to a prolonged siege that would allow enemy forces to concentrate against him, he chose to draw his opponents onto terrain better suited to the mobile warfare in which his forces excelled. The Catalonian plains, that vast expanse of open grassland southeast of Orléans, provided exactly the kind of battlefield where Hun tactical advantages could be most effectively utilized. The great battle that followed would be remembered as one of the decisive encounters of the ancient world, a clash between civilizations that determined the future of European development for centuries to come. The armies that faced each other on those windswept plains represented not merely competing military forces but fundamentally different approaches to political organization, cultural development, and human society itself. Attila's host, numbering perhaps 80,000 warriors drawn from across his vast empire, embodied the nomadic principle of personal loyalty and charismatic leadership. Hun cavalry formed the core of this force. Their composite bows and tactical mobility, providing the striking power that had terrorized enemies from China to Constantinople. Around this nucleus were arranged the various subject peoples of the Hunnic Confederation, each contributing their specialized skills to the common enterprise while maintaining their distinct identities and traditions. The coalition, assembled by Attius, was somewhat smaller but more professionally organized, reflecting the Roman emphasis on discipline and systematic training. The regular troops that formed its backbone had been schooled in the tactical methods that had built the empire, even though many were now barbarian foederati rather than Roman citizens. The Visigothic contingent provided heavy cavalry that could match Hun's striking power while offering superior protection and staying power in prolonged combat. The battle itself unfolded according to the complex choreography of 5th century warfare, with initial skirmishing giving way to coordinated charges and countercharges as each side sought to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. The Hun tactics that had proven so effective against Roman armies in open terrain were partially neutralized by the coalition's mixed forces, which combined Roman discipline with barbarian adaptability in ways that created new tactical possibilities. The death of King Theodoric of the Visigoths during the height of the battle demonstrated the risks that barbarian leaders accepted when they chose to fight personally in the front ranks of their forces. His loss deprived the coalition of experienced leadership at a crucial moment, yet it also inspired his followers to fight with increased desperation, knowing that defeat might mean the end of their independent existence. The outcome of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains remained uncertain until the final phases of the fighting, when Attila's decision to withdraw his forces behind the protection of his Wagenlager indicated that he had failed to achieve the decisive victory his campaign required. The coalition forces, too exhausted and disorganized to pursue, could claim to have halted the greatest barbarian invasion of the century. Yet they had not destroyed Attila's army, or ended the threat it represented. The aftermath of this great battle revealed the limitations of both military systems that had confronted each other on the Catalonian plains. Attila's forces retained their mobility and striking power, but they had been prevented from achieving the rapid conquest that nomadic logistics required. The Roman coalition had demonstrated its ability to resist barbarian assault, but it lacked the strength and unity needed to exploit its defensive success through offensive action. The withdrawal of Attila's forces from Gaul marked the end of the most serious threat to Roman authority in the West since the crisis of the 3rd century. Yet, it also revealed the fundamental weakness of an empire that could defend itself only through barbarian allies whose loyalty was contingent and whose interests were not necessarily aligned with Roman objectives. The victory at the Catalonian Plains had preserved the Western Empire for the moment, but it had also demonstrated that the empire's survival now depended upon the continuing divisions among its barbarian neighbors rather than upon its own inherent strength. As the campaign season of 451 drew toward its close, both sides could reflect upon a confrontation that had changed the strategic landscape of Europe without providing definitive resolution to the fundamental conflicts that had generated it. Attila remained master of the greatest military force in Europe, his reputation enhanced rather than diminished by a campaign that had demonstrated both his power and his prudence. The Western Empire had survived its greatest test, but at the cost of revealing weaknesses that ambitious enemies would not fail to exploit in future conflicts. The stage was now set for the final act of this drama, as Attila's attention turned toward the Italian peninsula and the symbolic heart of the Roman world. The scourge of God had been checked in Gaul, but his ambitions remained undiminished and his capabilities largely intact. The ancient world held its breath as it prepared for what might prove to be the ultimate confrontation between nomadic dynamism and imperial tradition. The winter of 451 passed like a held breath across the courts and capitals of Europe, as kings and emperors waited to see whether the great confrontation at the Catalonian plains had truly ended Attila's western ambitions, or merely postponed them to a more favorable season. The answer came with the spring thaws of 452, when the scouts and spies who watched the Hunnic territories brought word that the great barbarian host was stirring once again. Its attention now turned toward the most sacred prize in the Western world. Italy beckoned to Attila like a promise half remembered from childhood dreams, its fertile plains and wealthy cities offering both strategic advantage and symbolic triumph that Gaul, for all its riches, could never match. Here was the heartland of the empire that had once ruled the world, the peninsula that had given birth to Caesar and Augustus, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. To plant his standard on Italian soil would be to announce to all mankind that the age of Roman supremacy had finally ended, that a new dispensation had begun under the guidance of the scourge of God. The pretext for this Italian adventure remained the unresolved matter of Honoria and her claimed dowry, but the true motivations ran far deeper than matrimonial politics. The campaign in Gaul had demonstrated that the Western Empire, for all its weakness, could still mount effective resistance when properly organized and led. The coalition that Aetius had assembled on the Catalonian plains had fought with a desperation born of existential threat, their diverse elements unified by the common recognition that defeat would mean the end of their independent existence. Italy presented different opportunities and different challenges. The peninsula's geography favored defense, with the Alpine passes providing natural barriers that a determined enemy could hold against vastly superior numbers. Yet these same mountains would prevent the kind of rapid reinforcement and strategic mobility that had enabled Roman commanders to concentrate forces from across their territories when facing previous threats. Once Attila's host descended from the passes into the Po Valley, they would face scattered garrisons and isolated cities rather than the unified resistance that had checked them in Gaul. The psychological impact of an invasion of Italy would far exceed its immediate military consequences. For Romans throughout the empire, and barbarians beyond its frontiers, Italy remained the sacred center of imperial authority, the source from which legitimate power flowed to the farthest provinces. An attack upon Italian soil would be seen not merely as another barbarian raid, but as an assault upon the fundamental order of the civilized world. The preparations for this momentous campaign reflected the lessons that Attila had learned from his previous encounters with Roman defensive strategies. The host that gathered in the Hungarian plains during the early months of 452 was smaller than the great army that had invaded Gaul, but it was more carefully selected and better equipped for the specific challenges of Italian warfare. The siege train that accompanied the expedition included artillery pieces captured from Roman arsenals and engineers, trained in the latest techniques of fortress reduction. The route chosen for the invasion avoided the well-defended Alpine passes that had traditionally channeled barbarian incursions into Italy. Instead of attempting to force the strongly held positions that guarded the approaches to Gaul, Attila led his forces through the Julian Alps, following paths that brought them into the northeastern corner of Italy, with minimal resistance from Roman frontier forces. This strategic surprise allowed the Hunnic host to establish itself on Italian soil before effective countermeasures could be organized. The descent into the Friulian plain marked the beginning of a campaign of systematic devastation that would leave scars upon the Italian landscape for generations to come. The rich agricultural communities of the region, grown prosperous from centuries of peace and profitable trade, found themselves defenseless against an enemy whose approach to warfare had been refined through decades of successful conquest. City after city opened its gates in the face of Hunnic ultimatums, their populations choosing submission over the destruction that awaited those who resisted. Aquileia, the great fortress city that had guarded the northeastern approaches to Italy since the days of Augustus, became the first major test of Hunnic capabilities against Italian defenses. The city's massive walls had withstood numerous barbarian attacks over the centuries, and its garrison was reinforced by refugees from the surrounding countryside, who preferred the dangers of siege to the certainty of death or slavery that awaited them in Hunnic hands. The siege of Aquileia revealed the full extent to which Attila's military capabilities had evolved since his early campaigns against isolated Gothic settlements north of the Black Sea. The investment of the city was complete and professional, with circumvallation works that prevented relief forces from approaching, and contravallation fortifications that protected the besiegers from sorties by the desperate garrison. The siege engines that pounded the city's walls combined traditional Roman designs with innovations developed through Hunnic experience in siege warfare. The psychological warfare that accompanied the military operations was equally sophisticated. Attila's heralds proclaimed that resistance was useless, that the fall of Aquileia was foreordained by divine will, and that swift surrender would be rewarded with mercy, while prolonged defiance would result in complete destruction. These proclamations were reinforced by the systematic torture and execution of prisoners taken during preliminary skirmishes, their agonies serving as vivid reminders of the fate that awaited the city's inhabitants if they continued their resistance. The duration of the siege tested both the endurance of the defenders and the patience of the attackers, as weeks stretched into months without decisive resolution. The city's walls proved stronger than expected, its garrison more determined, its supplies more abundant than Hunnic intelligence had suggested. For a time, it appeared that Aquileia might repeat the success of Orléans, in demonstrating that determined resistance could check even Attila's seemingly irresistible advance. The breakthrough came not through military engineering, but through observation of natural phenomena that Hunnic shamanic traditions interpreted as divine guidance. According to the accounts preserved by later chroniclers, Attila noticed storks abandoning their nests on the city's walls, migrating with their young to safer locations beyond the reach of impending disaster. This omen was interpreted as a sign that the city was doomed, inspiring renewed efforts by the besiegers and correspondingly weakening the morale of the defenders. The fall of Aquileia sent shockwaves throughout Italy and beyond, announcing to the world that no Roman fortress, however strong or strategically positioned, was safe from Hunnic assault. The city's destruction was complete and methodical, its buildings razed, its population enslaved or scattered, its very stones carried away to build Hunnic fortifications elsewhere. The message was clear and unmistakable. This was not a raid for plunder, but a war of conquest and transformation. The advance toward Milan brought Attila's forces into the heart of northern Italy's economic and cultural life, where the accumulated wealth of centuries of Roman rule lay stored in temples, palaces, and private villas of unimaginable splendor. The contrast between the nomadic simplicity of the Hun war camps and the sophisticated luxury of Italian civilization could hardly have been more stark, yet it was the barbarians who held the initiative, while the inheritors of classical culture fled before their advance. Milan, the administrative capital of northern Italy and one of the great cities of the late Empire, faced the same terrible choice that had confronted Aquileia: resistance and destruction, or submission and survival. The city's leaders, having witnessed the fate of communities that had chosen defiance, opted for negotiation rather than siege. The terms they accepted were harsh but not impossible, requiring vast tribute payments and the surrender of hostages while allowing the city's basic structure to survive. The occupation of Milan demonstrated Attila's growing sophistication in the arts of imperial administration. Rather than simply looting the city and moving on, as traditional nomadic raiders might have done, he established a temporary government that maintained essential services while systematically extracting wealth and resources for the benefit of his war machine. Local officials who cooperated were retained in their positions, while those who resisted were replaced by Hun appointees or reliable collaborators. The psychological impact of seeing Hunnic horsemen patrolling the streets of Milan was profound and lasting. Here was visible proof that the old order had passed away, that the empire of Caesar and Constantine was no longer capable of protecting its most precious possessions. The sight of barbarian warriors examining Roman mosaics, their mud-stained boots treading on marble floors that had once echoed only to the footsteps of emperors and senators, symbolized a transformation that went far beyond mere military conquest. The advance toward Rome itself brought the campaign to its crucial decision point. As Attila's forces approached the symbolic and spiritual heart of the empire that had once ruled the world, the Eternal City, though no longer the administrative capital of the Western Empire, remained the ultimate prize for any conqueror who aspired to universal dominion. To enter Rome in triumph would be to claim the mantle of imperial authority that stretched back through more than 8 centuries of unbroken tradition. Yet the approach to Rome also presented Attila with challenges that had not been present in his earlier conquests. The city's defences, while not impregnable, were still formidable, and its garrison was reinforced by the accumulated wealth and prestige that made surrender unthinkable for many of its inhabitants. More importantly, the siege of Rome would inevitably attract the attention of every remaining Roman force in Italy, creating the possibility of being trapped between the city's walls and relieving armies. The diplomatic revolution that transformed this military confrontation into a negotiated settlement began with approaches from Roman officials who understood that their empire lacked the strength to resist Hunnic conquest through force alone. The embassy that approached Attila's camp outside Rome was led by Pope Leo I, whose moral authority transcended the political weakness of the imperial government, and whose presence gave weight to proposals that might otherwise have been dismissed as desperate expedients. The meeting between Pope Leo and Attila has become one of the most celebrated encounters of the ancient world. Shrouded in legend and religious interpretation that often obscures its purely political dimensions, the Christian tradition naturally emphasizes the spiritual aspects of the confrontation, portraying it as a triumph of faith over barbarism, of moral authority over brute force. Yet the historical reality was almost certainly more complex, involving practical considerations of logistics, strategy, and political advantage that both parties understood without necessarily acknowledging. The terms negotiated during this legendary encounter reflected the military and political realities of the situation rather than any supernatural intervention. Attila agreed to spare Rome and withdraw from Italy in exchange for substantial tribute payments and the recognition of his claims to Honoria and her theoretical dowry. These arrangements provided him with concrete gains while avoiding the risks and uncertainties of urban siege warfare against a desperate enemy fighting for its spiritual homeland. The decision to accept these terms rather than press forward to the ultimate prize of Rome itself reveals both the strengths and limitations of Attila's strategic thinking. His practical wisdom in recognizing the dangers of overextension was sound, particularly given the approach of summer's end and the need to return his forces to winter quarters before the Alpine passes became impassable. Yet, the decision also represented a missed opportunity that would never come again, as circumstances would never again align so favorably for barbarian conquest of the imperial heartland. The withdrawal from Italy was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the invasion, but it was accompanied by a level of destruction that exceeded even the devastation inflicted during the advance. Cities that had surrendered in the hope of preserving themselves found that their cooperation had earned them only temporary respite from Hunnic wrath. The message was clear. Submission to Attila might postpone destruction, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. The broader strategic consequences of the Italian campaign extended far beyond the immediate military results. The demonstration that barbarian forces could penetrate to the heart of Italy with relative impunity encouraged other ambitious leaders to consider their own opportunities for expansion at Roman expense. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa began planning maritime expeditions against Italian targets, while Germanic peoples in Gaul and Spain reassessed their relationships with imperial authorities who had proved incapable of defending their own homeland. The internal political ramifications within the Western Empire were equally significant. The Emperor Valentinian, already weakened by the scandals surrounding his sister's correspondence with Attila, found his authority further undermined by the evident inability of his government to protect its subjects from barbarian assault. The loyalty of provincial populations, strained by decades of increasing taxation and decreasing security, began to shift toward local strongmen who might provide more effective protection than distant imperial officials. The economic impact of the invasion was devastating and long-lasting, as the systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure and urban centers disrupted trade networks that had functioned for centuries. The tribute payments extracted by Attila drained the imperial treasury at a time when resources were desperately needed for military reconstruction and frontier defense. The psychological trauma of witnessing barbarian occupation of sacred Roman soil would influence Italian attitudes toward imperial authority for generations to come. The demographic consequences of the campaign included not only the immediate casualties of siege and sack, but also the longer-term effects of population, displacement, and economic disruption. Refugees from destroyed cities swelled the populations of surviving communities, straining resources and creating social tensions that persisted long after Attila's departure. The skilled craftsmen and educated administrators who fled Italian cities carried their expertise to other regions, contributing to the gradual shift of economic and cultural vitality away from traditional Roman centers. As Attila's forces recrossed the Alps into the Hungarian plains that had become the heartland of his empire, they carried with them wealth and prestige that elevated the barbarian confederation to unprecedented heights of power and influence. The successful invasion of Italy had demonstrated that no target was beyond Hunnic reach, no enemy too strong to resist the concentrated might of the steppe peoples united under effective leadership. Yet the very success of the Italian campaign contained the seeds of future challenges that would test the stability of Attila's achievements. The wealth extracted from Roman territories had to be distributed among followers whose expectations had been inflated by recent victories. The diverse peoples of the Hunnic Confederation had been held together by shared success, but their fundamental differences in culture, religion, and long-term objectives remained unresolved beneath the surface unity imposed by military triumph. The international situation that Attila faced upon his return from Italy was more complex than ever before, as his successes had generated new enemies and new challenges, alongside the wealth and prestige they had brought. The Eastern Roman Empire, relieved by the pressure that the Western campaign had taken off their own territories, was beginning to reconsider its tributary relationship with the barbarian king. The Persian Empire, observing Hunnic preoccupation with Roman affairs, was exploring opportunities for expansion in regions that had previously been beyond their reach. Most ominously, the very scope of Attila's achievements was creating internal pressures that threatened to tear apart the confederation he had spent decades building. Ambitious subordinates began to question whether their own interests might be better served through independence, rather than continued subordination to a leader whose success had made him increasingly remote from traditional steppe values. The seeds of the crisis that would follow Attila's death were already beginning to germinate in the rich soil of victory and conquest. As the year 452 drew toward its close, Attila stood at the pinnacle of barbarian achievement, master of an empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the shores of the Black Sea, conqueror of cities, whose names would echo through history as symbols of imperial glory and barbarian triumph. Yet the very magnitude of his success was creating new challenges that would test his leadership abilities in ways that military conquest never could, preparing the stage for the final act of a drama that had already transformed the ancient world beyond recognition. The spring of 453 arrived with omens that the shamans of Attila's court interpreted with growing unease, their traditional divination practices revealing portents of change and uncertainty that cast shadows across the triumphal atmosphere following the successful Italian campaign. The king himself, now approaching his 53rd year, seemed touched by a restlessness that his closest advisors attributed to the natural ambitions of a conqueror who had exhausted the obvious targets for expansion, but whose appetite for achievement remained undiminished. The court that had celebrated the extraction of tribute from Rome and the humiliation of Pope Leo now found itself grappling with the complex challenges of governing an empire that stretched across half of Europe. The wealth accumulated through decades of conquest and extortion had created unprecedented opportunities for patronage and display, yet it had also generated expectations among Attila's followers that grew more difficult to satisfy with each passing season. The Gothic nobles, who had once been grateful for modest shares of Hunnic plunder, now demanded rewards proportionate to their contributions to campaigns that had brought entire provinces under barbarian control. The administrative burden of managing such diverse territories and populations had grown beyond the capacity of traditional steppe governance methods, forcing Attila to delegate increasing authority to subordinates whose loyalty was tested by the temptations of quasi-independent power. One Agesius, and the other Roman-born officials who had provided the bureaucratic expertise necessary for imperial administration, found themselves caught between conflicting demands from their barbarian masters and the subject populations they were supposed to govern effectively. The military challenges facing the Hunnic Confederation were equally complex, as success had bred new enemies while traditional opponents adapted their strategies to counter proven Hunnic advantages. The Eastern Roman Empire, freed from the immediate pressure of Western campaigns, was quietly rebuilding its Danubian defenses and exploring alliance possibilities with various Germanic peoples who had grown wary of Hunnic expansion. The Persian Empire, observing the preoccupation of both Roman governments with barbarian threats, was probing opportunities for territorial gains in Armenia and Mesopotamia that might compensate for their previous losses to Arab raiders. Into this atmosphere of mounting complexity and subtle tension, Attila introduced what would prove to be the final complication of his extraordinary career. Despite his advanced age and the political dangers inherent in dynastic arrangements within the Hunnic Confederation, he chose to take another wife, a young woman named Ildiko, whose Gothic origins and striking beauty had attracted his attention during the distribution of captives following the Italian campaign. The wedding feast that celebrated this union in March of 453 brought together representatives from across Attila's empire in a display of wealth and power that surpassed even the most extravagant celebrations of previous years. The great hall of the royal compound groaned under the weight of golden vessels looted from Roman temples, silver plates stripped from Byzantine palaces, and silk tapestries that had once adorned the homes of Gallic aristocrats. The assembled guests consumed wine from the finest vineyards of Gaul and ate delicacies transported from the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean world. Yet beneath the surface magnificence of this celebration lay currents of unease that perceptive observers noted with growing concern. The king himself, though maintaining his customary dignity and apparent vigor, showed signs of the physical strain that decades of constant campaigning and administrative responsibility had imposed upon his frame. His appetite for the rich foods that filled the royal table seemed diminished. His attention to the elaborate entertainments provided for his guests appeared forced, and his responses to the ceremonial toasts offered by visiting dignitaries lacked the sharp wit and political acuity that had made him such a formidable negotiator. The night of celebration stretched long into the darkness, with successive waves of entertainment designed to honor both the king and his new bride, while demonstrating the cultural sophistication that Hunnic patronage had fostered among the Confederation's subject peoples. Gothic singers performed epic ballads that celebrated Attila's victories, while subtly emphasizing the contributions of their own people to his success. Allen dancers displayed the equestrian skills that had made their cavalry so valuable to Hunnic armies. Roman poets recited verses that compared their barbarian patron to the greatest heroes of classical antiquity. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed more freely, the conversations among the assembled guests began to reveal underlying tensions that sober diplomacy normally concealed. Gothic nobles exchanged meaningful glances when discussing the distribution of spoils from recent campaigns. Gepid chieftains spoke in hushed tones about the increasing demands for military service that left their own territories vulnerable to raiders from beyond the Confederation's frontiers. Even the Hun aristocrats who formed the core of Attila's support showed signs of the strain that constant expansion had placed upon their traditional lifestyle and values. The king himself retired early from the festivities, accompanied by his new bride, to the private chambers that had been prepared for their wedding night. Those who observed his departure noted that he appeared unsteady on his feet, though whether from the effects of celebration or some deeper malaise remained unclear. The loyal retainers who attended him attributed any signs of weakness to the natural exhaustion of a long day's ceremonial obligations, rather than any serious concern about his health or well-being. The dawn of the following morning brought with it a discovery that would transform the course of European history as dramatically as any military victory or diplomatic triumph in Attila's long career. Servants attempting to rouse the king for his customary morning councils found the royal chambers sealed from within, their repeated knocking and calling producing no response from the man whose word had been law across half the continent. When the doors were finally forced open, the scene that greeted the horrified attendants defied immediate comprehension. Attila lay motionless upon his marriage bed, his face peaceful but cold, his body showing no signs of the violent struggle that might have been expected if enemies had somehow penetrated the heart of his heavily guarded compound. Beside him, his young bride huddled in terrified confusion, her wedding garments stained with blood but her person apparently unharmed. The immediate assumption among those who discovered the scene was that assassination had claimed the life of the man who had seemed invulnerable to all the weapons that his enemies had arrayed against him. The possibility that foreign agents might have succeeded where entire armies had failed sent waves of panic through the royal compound as guards searched frantically for intruders and questioned every person who had attended the previous evening's celebrations. Yet careful examination of the evidence revealed a different and more mysterious truth. The blood that had initially suggested violence proved to come from Attila's own nose and mouth, indicating internal bleeding rather than external wounds. His bride's account of the night's events, delivered through tears and barely coherent with shock, described no attackers, no struggle, no indication of any external threat to the king's safety. The physicians summoned to examine Attila's body were men skilled in the medical traditions of Rome and Byzantium, their expertise supplemented by the herbal knowledge of Hun shamans and the practical experience of treating battlefield injuries. Their consensus diagnosis pointed toward a catastrophic hemorrhage, possibly caused by the rupture of blood vessels weakened by years of physical stress and exacerbated by the evening's heavy consumption of wine and rich food. The official explanation that emerged from these investigations satisfied most observers, while leaving enough ambiguity to fuel speculation that would persist for centuries afterward. Attila had died from natural causes, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated strain of a lifetime spent in the saddle and on campaign. Yet whispers persisted about the convenient timing of his death, for enemies who had despaired of defeating him through conventional means, and about the possible role of his young bride in events that had unfolded within the privacy of the royal bedchamber. The immediate aftermath of Attila's death revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of the personal empire he had constructed through 3 decades of conquest and consolidation. The news of his passing was initially suppressed while his closest advisors attempted to manage the succession crisis that they knew must inevitably follow. The Hun tradition of dividing inheritance among multiple heirs conflicted with the practical requirements of maintaining unity among the Confederation's diverse peoples, creating a situation that no amount of careful planning could have completely resolved. Elac, Dengizic, and Ernak, the three sons of Attila's principal wife Krika, each possessed legitimate claims to portions of their father's legacy, yet none commanded the universal respect and fear that had held the Confederation together under unified leadership. The Gothic nobles who had served as Attila's vassals saw opportunity in this division of authority, while the various Germanic peoples who had been incorporated into the Hunnic Empire began to reassess their relationships with masters whose power no longer seemed absolute. The funeral rites that honored Attila's passing combined elements from multiple religious traditions in a ceremony that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of his empire, while attempting to demonstrate continuity of authority under his successors. Hun shamanic practices governed the central rituals, with the king's body displayed in a silk pavilion, while mourners performed the traditional lamentations of the steppes. Gothic Christian bishops offered prayers for the dead ruler's soul, while Roman priests conducted ceremonies designed to ensure his peaceful transition to whatever afterlife awaited barbarian conquerors. The burial itself was conducted according to Hun custom, with Attila's body interred along with vast quantities of gold and silver that would accompany him on his journey to the eternal hunting grounds. The location of this burial was kept secret from all but a handful of trusted retainers, and according to legend, those who had participated in the interment were themselves killed to ensure that the grave could never be found and desecrated by enemies seeking revenge upon the dead king. Yet even as these ceremonial observances attempted to maintain the illusion of continuity and stability, the practical business of governing the Confederation was revealing the impossibility of preserving Attila's legacy intact. The tribute payments that had flowed from Constantinople and Ravenna were contingent upon the credible threat of renewed military action, a threat that the divided leadership of the Hun successors could not effectively maintain. The subject peoples who had accepted Hunnic authority in the face of overwhelming force began to calculate whether their chances might be better under new arrangements. The first open challenges to the new order came from within the Confederation itself, as Germanic peoples who had been incorporated into the Hunnic Empire through conquest rather than voluntary alliance saw opportunity in the succession crisis. The Gepids, led by their king Ardaric, formed the nucleus of a coalition that included Ostrogoths, Rugians, and other peoples who had chafed under Hunnic dominance but had lacked the strength to resist while Attila lived. The great battle that determined the fate of the Hunnic Empire was fought at Nadao, somewhere in the Pannonian plains that had been the heartland of Attila's power. The opposing forces that met in this decisive encounter represented not merely competing military factions, but fundamentally different visions of how post-Roman Europe might be organized. Elac and his brothers sought to preserve their father's legacy through continued Hunnic hegemony over the various Germanic peoples, while Ardaric and his allies fought for the principle of independent kingdoms that would acknowledge no barbarian overlord. The battle itself was a disaster for Hunnic arms, with Elac himself falling in the fighting along with many of the veteran warriors who had served his father in campaigns from Constantinople to Rome. The military advantages that had made the Huns so formidable under unified leadership proved insufficient when divided authority prevented the kind of coordinated tactical response that had characterized their greatest victories. The collapse of Hunnic power following Nadao was as rapid and complete as its rise had been under Attila's leadership. Dengizic and Ernak, the surviving sons, found themselves reduced to minor chieftains governing fragments of their father's empire, while their former subjects established independent kingdoms or sought new alliances with Roman authorities. The great migration of peoples that followed the battle redistributed the demographic map of Central Europe, with Ostrogoths moving toward Italy, Gepids establishing kingdoms in Hungary, and various smaller peoples seeking new homes in regions that had been depopulated by decades of warfare. The speed of this imperial dissolution demonstrated both the personal nature of Attila's authority and the fundamental instability of nomadic empires that depended upon continuous success to maintain the loyalty of diverse subject populations. Without the unifying presence of a leader whose reputation made resistance seem hopeless, the confederation fragmented along the ethnic and cultural lines that political unity had temporarily obscured but never eliminated. The Roman governments that had lived in terror of Attila's name found themselves presented with unprecedented opportunities to recover territories and influence that had seemed permanently lost to barbarian conquest. Yet their ability to exploit these opportunities was limited by the same military and financial weaknesses that had made them vulnerable to Hunnic pressure in the first place. The Western Empire lacked the resources to reconquer territories that had been devastated by decades of warfare, while the Eastern Empire was preoccupied with Persian threats and internal religious controversies. The ultimate fate of Attila's surviving sons reflected the broader tragedy of the Hunnic collapse. Dengizic continued to raid Roman territories until he was eventually killed in battle with Byzantine forces, his head displayed in Constantinople as a trophy of imperial victory over barbarian ambition. Ernak survived longer by adapting to changed circumstances, accepting a subordinate role within the new political order that emerged from the ruins of his father's empire. The archaeological evidence for the end of the Hunnic period reveals a pattern of abandoned settlements, destroyed fortifications, and disrupted trade networks that speaks to the comprehensive nature of the political and economic collapse that followed Attila's death. The material culture that had flourished under Hunnic patronage disappeared with remarkable speed, as craftsmen and artists either fled to new patrons or adapted their skills to different aesthetic traditions. The demographic impact of the Hunnic collapse included not only the immediate casualties of the succession wars, but also the longer-term effects of population movements that continued for decades after Nadao. Hun communities that had maintained their distinct identity under Attila's leadership were absorbed into other ethnic groups or dispersed across such wide areas that their cultural coherence was permanently lost. The psychological impact upon contemporaries was equally profound, as the sudden collapse of what had seemed to be an irresistible force demonstrated the contingent nature of all political arrangements and the ultimate dependence of even the mightiest empires upon the mortal individuals who led them. The man who had seemed to embody divine wrath and earthly conquest was revealed to have been as vulnerable to the common fate of humanity as any peasant or slave. Within a generation of Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire had become a memory, its former territories divided among Germanic kingdoms, whose rulers claimed legitimacy through Gothic or Roman precedent rather than steppe tradition. The great migration of peoples that had been set in motion by Hun expansion continued under its own momentum, but the driving force that had given it direction and purpose was gone forever. The lesson of this collapse was not lost upon contemporary observers, who recognized in the fate of Attila's empire a demonstration of both the possibilities and limitations of personal rule in an age of political transformation. The barbarian king who had humbled emperors and terrorized civilizations had ultimately been defeated, not by any human enemy, but by the biological limitations that constrain all mortal ambition, leaving behind a legacy of conquest that proved as fragile as the individual will that had created it. The death of Attila marked not merely the end of a man, but the beginning of a transformation in human memory itself, as the historical figure who had terrorized the civilized world gradually evolved into something far more enduring and complex than any mortal conqueror could hope to achieve through military victory alone. Within decades of his passing, the process had already begun by which the barbarian king would transcend the limitations of historical fact to become a figure of legend, myth, and eternal fascination for peoples who had never felt the thunder of Hunnic hoofbeats or witnessed the smoke rising from cities reduced to ash by his command. The earliest chroniclers who attempted to record Attila's legacy faced the impossible task of separating reliable historical information from the propaganda, rumor, and deliberate mythologization that had surrounded his career even while he lived. Roman historians, writing for audiences that had lived through the terror of Hunnic invasions, naturally emphasized the destructive aspects of his reign, while struggling to acknowledge the grudging respect that his abilities had earned even among his enemies. Gothic storytellers, preserving oral traditions that would eventually find their way into written form, portrayed him as a figure of both fear and admiration whose court had provided opportunities for advancement that the declining Roman world could no longer offer. The speed with which historical memory transformed into legendary narrative reflected the profound psychological impact that Attila had made upon the collective consciousness of 5th century Europe. Here was a figure who had seemed to embody forces larger than any individual personality, whose very existence had challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization, barbarism, and the natural order of human society. The man who had demanded tribute from emperors and received embassies from popes could not simply be forgotten when his body was laid to rest in some secret grave on the Hungarian plains. The Christian interpretation of Attila's legacy, which would dominate European historical consciousness for more than a millennium, cast him in the role of divine instrument, the scourge of God sent to chastise a sinful world for its departure from righteous paths. This theological framework, developed by writers like Bishop Hydatius and refined by later chroniclers such as Gregory of Tours, provided a comfortable explanation for the temporary triumph of barbarism over civilization by placing it within the larger context of divine providence and moral instruction. Yet even within this Christian interpretive framework, Attila's character proved too complex for simple demonization. The same sources that portrayed him as an instrument of divine wrath also recorded his moments of mercy, his respect for holy men like Pope Leo, and his adherence to his own moral code even when dealing with enemies who had shown him no such consideration. The barbarian king who could order the destruction of entire cities could also spare Rome at the request of a Christian bishop, suggesting depths of character that transcended the simple categories of good and evil that medieval chroniclers preferred to employ. The Germanic epic traditions that preserved Attila's memory in the oral literature of Northern Europe presented him in an entirely different light, as a generous ring-giver and patron of warriors, whose court represented the height of heroic civilization rather than its antithesis. The Old Norse sagas that eventually recorded these traditions knew him as Atli, a figure who embodied both the possibilities and dangers of absolute power, while maintaining the essential nobility that Germanic culture demanded from its greatest leaders. The Nibelungenlied, that great German epic that reached its mature form in the 13th century, transformed Attila into Etzel, a king whose court served as the setting for the final tragedy of the Burgundian heroes. In this legendary context, Attila became not the destroyer of civilization, but its ultimate representative, a figure whose wisdom, wealth, and power attracted the greatest heroes of his age, while his desire for justice ultimately led to their doom. The historical scourge of God had become a literary symbol of the tragic nature of heroic ambition and the inevitable collision between personal honor and political necessity. The Hungarian tradition that claimed direct descent from Attila's people represented perhaps the most complex transformation of his historical legacy, beginning in the medieval period and persisting well into the modern era. Magyar historians and chroniclers constructed elaborate genealogies that connected their nation's ruling dynasties to the great Hun king, despite the complete absence of credible historical evidence for such connections. This invented relationship served important political and cultural functions, providing the Kingdom of Hungary with a legendary pedigree that rivaled those of other European monarchies while legitimizing Magyar territorial claims in Central Europe. The persistence of this Hungarian-Hunnic connection, in the face of overwhelming scholarly skepticism, demonstrates the power of legendary identity to transcend historical fact when it serves essential, psychological and political needs. Modern genetic and linguistic research has conclusively demonstrated that the Magyars were not descendants of Attila's Huns, yet the emotional investment in this connection remains strong enough to influence popular culture and political rhetoric even in contemporary Hungary. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought new perspectives on Attila's legacy as humanist scholars gained access to Byzantine and Roman sources that medieval chroniclers had either ignored or been unable to consult. Writers like Edward Gibbon, working with a broader range of primary sources and influenced by Enlightenment concepts of historical causation, began to construct more nuanced interpretations of Attila's role in the transformation of the ancient world. Yet even these more sophisticated historical analyses could not entirely escape the legendary accretions that had gathered around Attila's memory during the millennium since his death. The barbarian king had become such a powerful symbol of historical change and cultural transformation that objective analysis of his actual achievements proved nearly impossible to separate from the mythological significance that later ages had invested in his figure. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries found in Attila a particularly compelling figure who embodied their fascination with the primitive, the sublime, and the transformative power of individual will. Writers like Lord Byron and Victor Hugo portrayed him as a force of nature incarnate, a figure whose very existence challenged the artificial constraints of civilized society while demonstrating the terrible beauty of uncompromising authenticity. This romantic interpretation of Attila's legacy emphasized his role as destroyer of decadent institutions, rather than creator of new forms of political organization, casting him as a necessary agent of historical renewal, whose violence cleared the ground for future cultural development. The barbarian king became a symbol of creative destruction, a figure who embodied the romantic belief that genuine progress required the complete overthrow of established order rather than its gradual reform. The rise of nationalism in 19th century Europe brought new political dimensions to Attila's legendary status, as various ethnic groups claimed him as either ancestor or enemy, according to their particular historical narratives. German scholars emphasized his role in destroying Roman authority in territories that would eventually become part of the German nation, while French historians portrayed him as the ultimate foreign threat against which Gallic civilization had heroically defended itself. The emergence of racial theories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries added sinister new dimensions to these nationalist interpretations of Attila's legacy. The concept of the yellow peril that influenced European attitudes toward Asian peoples drew explicitly upon the memory of Hunnic invasions, suggesting that Attila's campaigns represented an eternal struggle between European and Asian civilizations that transcended the specific historical circumstances of the 5th century. These racialized interpretations of Attila's legacy reached their most extreme form during the First World War, when British and French propaganda routinely referred to German soldiers as Huns, in deliberate echo of the barbarian invasions that had brought down the Roman Empire. This association was both historically nonsensical, given that Germanic peoples had been among Attila's primary victims, and politically effective, as it tapped into deep-seated fears about the fragility of civilized society in the face of organized barbarism. The archaeological discoveries of the 20th century began to provide new evidence about the material culture of Attila's empire, revealing a level of sophistication that challenged popular stereotypes about barbarian primitiveness. The excavation of Hunnic burial sites uncovered jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects that demonstrated remarkable artistic achievement and extensive trade connections across Eurasia. Yet these archaeological findings proved insufficient to dispel the legendary accretions that had gathered around Attila's memory, partly because the physical evidence remained fragmentary, and partly because the mythological significance of his figure had become too deeply embedded in European cultural consciousness to be easily displaced by scholarly correction. The totalitarian movements of the 20th century found in Attila a particularly compelling historical precedent for their own claims to represent world historical transformation through the application of superior will and organization. Both Nazi and Soviet propagandists drew upon his example when arguing for the necessity of destroying decadent bourgeois civilization, though they differed in their assessment of whether his legacy represented a positive or negative model for contemporary political action. The Cold War period brought renewed scholarly interest in Attila's historical role as historians, on both sides of the ideological divide, sought to understand the processes by which established political orders could be rapidly transformed through the application of concentrated force. The barbarian king, who had humbled the Roman Empire, became a case study in the dynamics of imperial collapse and the vulnerability of seemingly stable institutions to determined external pressure. Contemporary popular culture has continued to find in Attila a figure of enduring fascination, as novelists, filmmakers, and video game designers have drawn upon his legendary status to explore themes of leadership, cultural conflict, and historical transformation. These modern interpretations often reveal more about contemporary anxieties and aspirations than about 5th century realities, demonstrating the continued power of Attila's legacy to serve as a mirror for each age's particular concerns and preoccupations. The academic study of Attila's historical significance has become increasingly sophisticated as scholars have gained access to new sources and developed more refined methodologies for analyzing the sparse and biased evidence that survives from his era. Modern historians recognize that the traditional focus on his military campaigns and political achievements provides only a partial understanding of his broader impact on the transformation of European civilization. Recent scholarship has emphasized the economic and demographic dimensions of Hunnic expansion, analyzing how the disruption of trade networks and population movements initiated by Attila's campaigns contributed to the broader transformation of European society during the transition from antiquity to the medieval period. These studies reveal that his legacy extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences of his conquests to encompass fundamental changes in settlement patterns, economic organization, and cultural development. The genetic studies that have revolutionized our understanding of European population history have provided new evidence about the biological legacy of the Hunnic migrations, revealing that Attila's followers left detectable traces in the DNA of modern European populations. Despite the political collapse of their empire, these findings demonstrate that the historical impact of nomadic invasions extended beyond their immediate political consequences to include lasting demographic changes that influenced the genetic composition of settled populations. Yet even as scientific methodologies provide new tools for understanding Attila's historical significance, the legendary dimensions of his legacy continue to evolve in response to contemporary cultural needs and concerns. The barbarian king, who once symbolized the triumph of primitive force over civilized weakness, has been reinterpreted as a figure who anticipated modern concepts of multiculturalism and political integration, his diverse empire serving as a model for contemporary efforts to create unified societies from ethnically diverse populations. The environmental historians who have begun to analyze the ecological impact of historical migrations, have found in Attila's campaigns evidence for the ways in which political disruption can generate environmental change through altered land use patterns and population distributions. The systematic destruction that accompanied Hunnic invasions contributed to reforestation in some areas and agricultural abandonment in others, creating ecological changes that persisted long after the political circumstances that generated them had passed. The digital humanities approaches that are transforming historical scholarship have created new possibilities for analyzing the sparse documentary evidence about Attila's career, using computational methods to extract information from sources that traditional analytical techniques might overlook. These technological innovations promise to reveal new dimensions of his historical significance, while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations of evidence-based approaches when dealing with figures whose legendary status has overwhelmed their historical reality. The contemporary fascination with leadership studies has found in Attila a particularly compelling case study of charismatic authority and organizational effectiveness under extreme circumstances. Business schools and military academies now include analyses of his strategic decision-making and coalition-building techniques in their curricula, treating the barbarian king as a historical example of successful management practices, despite the obvious moral and cultural differences between his context and contemporary organizational environments. The post-colonial perspectives that have influenced modern historical writing have begun to reinterpret Attila's legacy as part of a broader pattern of resistance to imperial domination, casting him as a representative of peripheral peoples who successfully challenged the hegemonic pretensions of classical civilization. This interpretation emphasizes his role in creating space for alternative forms of political and cultural organization, rather than simply destroying established institutions. The feminist historians who have analyzed the gender dimensions of political power in the ancient world have found in the Honoria episode evidence for the ways in which women's agency could influence major historical developments, even within patriarchal societies that formerly excluded them from political authority. Honoria's appeal to Attila has been reinterpreted as a form of resistance to masculine control that inadvertently contributed to one of the most significant military campaigns of the 5th century. The religious studies scholars who have examined the spiritual dimensions of political authority have found in Attila's shamanic background evidence for the persistence of non-Christian religious traditions within the supposedly Christianized world of late antiquity. His career demonstrates the continued importance of traditional spiritual practices in legitimizing political power, even as Christianity was establishing its dominance over European religious life. The comparative historians who analyze patterns of nomadic state formation across different historical periods and geographical regions have placed Attila's empire within the broader context of steppe politics and Eurasian connectivity. These studies reveal that his achievements were part of a recurring pattern of nomadic expansion that connected distant regions of the Eurasian landmass through networks of trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. As we approach the 1600th anniversary of Attila's death, his legacy continues to evolve in response to new scholarly discoveries and changing cultural concerns. The barbarian king who once terrorized the civilized world has become a figure of perpetual fascination, whose historical significance transcends the specific circumstances of his 5th century career to encompass fundamental questions about power, culture, and historical change that remain relevant to contemporary human experience. The ultimate measure of Attila's historical importance may lie not in the territories he conquered or the cities he destroyed, but in his persistent ability to capture human imagination across the centuries. The man who emerged from the steppes to challenge the greatest empire the world had known has become an eternal symbol of the unpredictable forces that shape human destiny. A reminder that even the most stable and powerful institutions remain vulnerable to the transformative power of individual will and historical circumstance. As we reach the end of our journey with Attila the Hun, we find ourselves not merely at the conclusion of one man's remarkable life, but at a crossroads of human understanding. The figure who once struck terror into the hearts of emperors and commanded the loyalty of countless warriors has become something far more complex and enduring than any historical personage could achieve through conquest alone. In the gentle transition between waking and sleeping consciousness, we can perceive the deeper truths that his extraordinary story continues to illuminate about the nature of power, the fragility of civilizations, and the eternal human struggle between order and chaos. The barbarian king who emerged from the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia to challenge the greatest empire the world had known represents far more than a military commander or political leader. Attila became a force of historical transformation whose impact transcended the immediate consequences of his campaigns to reshape the fundamental structure of European civilization. The world he left behind was irrevocably different from the one he had inherited. Its political boundaries redrawn, its cultural assumptions challenged, its future trajectory permanently altered by the intervention of this singular personality. Yet, in contemplating the ultimate meaning of Attila's legacy, we must acknowledge that his true conquest was not of territories or peoples, but of human imagination itself. The historical figure who lived and died in the 5th century has evolved into something approaching mythological status, a symbol that each successive age has reinterpreted according to its own needs, fears, and aspirations. The scourge of God has become a mirror in which civilizations examine their own assumptions about barbarism and refinement, about the sources of political authority and the limits of human ambition. The lessons embedded in Attila's story speak to fundamental aspects of the human condition that transcend the specific circumstances of late antiquity. His rise from obscure nomadic origins to world historical significance demonstrates the unpredictable nature of individual destiny and the ways in which personal characteristics can interact with historical circumstances to produce consequences that no one could have foreseen. The boy born into a traditional steppe society became the man who would determine the fate of empires, illustrating the profound truth that human potential often remains hidden until circumstances call it forth. The political innovations that Attila developed in governing his diverse empire offer insights into the challenges of creating unity from diversity that remain relevant to contemporary societies grappling with similar questions of integration and identity. His ability to maintain the loyalty of Germanic warriors, Roman administrators, and nomadic chieftains while preserving their distinct cultural characteristics suggests approaches to multicultural governance that anticipate modern concepts of inclusive leadership and cultural synthesis. The military revolution that Attila initiated through his combination of nomadic mobility with settled society siege techniques demonstrates the transformative potential that emerges when different traditions are creatively synthesized rather than simply combined. His tactical innovations influenced the development of European warfare for centuries afterward, showing how individual genius can accelerate the evolution of human knowledge and capability in ways that reshape entire fields of endeavor. The diplomatic sophistication that Attila displayed in his negotiations with Roman and Persian representatives reveals an intelligence that went far beyond the crude stereotypes of barbarian leadership that his enemies preferred to propagate. His mastery of multiple languages, his understanding of complex political relationships, and his ability to exploit the internal divisions of his opponents demonstrate intellectual capabilities that challenge simplistic distinctions between civilized and primitive societies. The economic transformations that resulted from Attila's campaigns extended far beyond the immediate effects of conquest and tribute extraction to encompass fundamental changes in trade patterns, population distributions, and resource allocations that influenced European development for generations. His empire served as a catalyst for economic integration across vast geographical areas, creating commercial networks that connected previously isolated regions and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Attila's court represents one of history's most remarkable examples of creative fusion between different civilizational traditions. The artistic techniques, literary forms, and intellectual approaches that developed under Hunnic patronage combined elements from across Eurasia to create new synthetic expressions that transcended their individual components. This cultural flowering demonstrates the innovative potential that can emerge when diverse traditions encounter each other under conditions that encourage creative rather than destructive interaction. The religious dimensions of Attila's legacy reveal the complex ways in which spiritual traditions adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics. His shamanic background provided him with sources of authority and legitimacy that complemented his military and diplomatic achievements, while his tolerance for diverse religious practices among his subjects created space for theological development that might not have occurred under more restrictive conditions. The demographic impact of the population movements initiated by Attila's campaigns contributed to the genetic and cultural diversity that characterizes modern European societies. The migrations that followed in the wake of Hunnic expansion distributed peoples, languages, and customs across the continent in patterns that continue to influence contemporary ethnic and national identities. These demographic changes represent one of the most enduring aspects of Attila's historical legacy, embedded in the very biological and cultural fabric of European civilization. The technological innovations that developed within Attila's empire reflect the accelerated pace of change that occurs when different knowledge systems encounter each other under conditions that reward practical effectiveness over traditional authority. The metallurgical techniques, engineering methods, and organizational systems that emerged from this cultural contact influenced technological development across multiple civilizations and contributed to the broader advancement of human capability. The literary and artistic traditions that preserve Attila's memory in various cultural contexts demonstrate the power of legendary figures to serve as vehicles for exploring universal human themes. The Germanic epics that celebrate his generosity, the Christian chronicles that emphasize his role as divine instrument, and the Hungarian traditions that claim him as ancestral founder all utilize his figure to examine questions about heroism, justice, and historical destiny that transcend the specific circumstances of his life and career. The psychological impact of Attila's achievements on both his contemporaries and subsequent generations reveals the profound human need for figures who embody the possibility of transcending apparent limitations and achieving the seemingly impossible. His transformation from nomadic chieftain to world conqueror provides a narrative template for understanding how individual determination can overcome circumstances that appear insurmountable, inspiring hope and ambition across cultural and temporal boundaries. The educational value of Attila's story lies not merely in its historical content, but in its demonstration of the complex relationships between individual agency and structural forces in shaping human destiny. His career illustrates how personal characteristics interact with environmental conditions, cultural traditions, and historical circumstances to produce outcomes that reflect both human choice and external constraint. This complexity makes his story a valuable case study for understanding the multifaceted nature of historical causation. The moral dimensions of Attila's legacy resist simple categorization, as his achievements were inextricably linked with violence, destruction, and the suffering of countless innocent people. Yet his story also demonstrates capacities for leadership, cultural creativity, and political innovation that expanded human possibilities in significant ways. This moral ambiguity reflects the broader truth that historical progress often emerges from sources that challenge conventional ethical categories and require nuanced rather than simplistic evaluation. The contemporary relevance of Attila's example lies partly in his demonstration of how rapidly established institutions can be transformed when faced with challenges that exploit their fundamental weaknesses. His success against Roman authority illustrates the vulnerability of complex systems to disruption by more adaptive and flexible opponents, a lesson that remains applicable to contemporary organizations and societies facing their own transformational pressures. The ultimate significance of Attila's historical role may lie in his embodiment of the creative destruction that periodically reshapes human civilization by clearing away outdated structures and creating space for new forms of organization to emerge. His campaigns contributed to the end of the ancient world and the beginning of medieval Europe, participating in one of history's great transitional moments when established patterns gave way to unprecedented possibilities. As we settle into the peaceful rhythms of approaching sleep, we can find in Attila's story a reminder that human history unfolds according to patterns that transcend individual lives, while remaining dependent upon individual choices and capabilities. The nomadic chieftain who became the terror of the civilized world demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of human agency in shaping historical development, showing how extraordinary individuals can influence the course of events while remaining subject to the same biological and environmental constraints that govern all mortal existence. The legacy that Attila bequeathed to future generations extends far beyond the immediate consequences of his military and political achievements to encompass fundamental insights about leadership, cultural synthesis, and historical change that continue to inform human understanding. His example reminds us that the most significant historical transformations often emerge from unexpected sources and develop in ways that surprise both participants and observers, requiring us to remain open to possibilities that transcend conventional expectations and assumptions. In the end, Attila's greatest conquest may have been his conquest of time itself, his transformation from a historical figure bound by the limitations of 5th century existence into a symbolic presence that continues to engage human imagination and illuminate universal truths about power, ambition, and the mysterious forces that shape human destiny. His story survives not because it provides simple lessons or comfortable answers, but because it embodies the complexity and wonder of human existence in its full tragic and triumphant dimensions. Rest now in this knowledge that you too are part of this great continuing story, your own dreams and struggles, adding new chapters to the endless book of human becoming. The boy from the steppes who became the scourge of God reminds us that individual lives matter in ways that transcend immediate circumstances, that personal choices contribute to larger patterns of meaning and development, and that every human being participates in the magnificent mystery of consciousness exploring itself through time. Sleep well, knowing that even in rest, you contribute to the ongoing story of human civilization, adding your own unique voice to the eternal conversation between past and future, individual and collective, the possible and the actual that defines our shared journey through the cosmos.